My name is Aubrey Price. I am 46 years old. 6 weeks ago, I sat at the head of a glass conference table in Pierre and slid a stack of forged loan documents toward my husband of 20 years. I watched his face turn the color of wet ash. I watched his corporate partner scramble away from the fallout, realizing her own career was collateral damage. But to understand how I legally dismantled the man I promised to spend my life with, I have to take you back to the moment he signed his own demise with a single joke at our anniversary party. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from him, welcome to Emily Told Stories. Please take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy the narrative. I would love to know your age and where you are listening from today, so please drop a comment below. The air inside the Black Hills Lodge smelled of roasted ribeye, sharp pine, and expensive bourbon. We were celebrating 2 decades of marriage. I spent my days navigating the unyielding world of agricultural compliance across the rolling eastern prairies of South Dakota, protecting local farmers from predatory land grabs. Miles, my husband, was a commercial real estate developer. He thrived in rooms like this, surrounded by local politicians, wealthy landowners, and corporate investors. He wore a custom-tailored suit that cost more than my first car, projecting the image of a man who owned the world. Before dinner began, I stood near the oak-paneled bar, nursing a sparkling water with lime. Miles leaned over the polished wood, signaling the bartender to pour another round of top-shelf drinks for a group of potential clients. He slid his primary credit card across the counter with a practiced flick of his wrist. A minute later, the bartender stepped back and leaned in close, keeping his voice low. The card was declined. I watched a muscle feather along my husband's jawline. A thin sheen of sweat caught the dim light on his forehead. His knuckles paled as he gripped his glass, staring at the small plastic rectangle like it had betrayed him. He produced a different card from his money clip, waving off the incident to the men around him with a smooth laugh, blaming a temporary bank glitch. It seemed trivial then, a minor inconvenience for a man who traded in 7-figure deals. I let it go, assuming it was just a security hold. An hour later, the clinking of silverware faded. Miles stood up at the head of our long table to give his toast. He loved a captive audience. He spoke about our early days building his firm from the ground up, the late nights and the sacrifices we made. The room listened raptly. He painted a picture of a perfect partnership. Then he paused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. A familiar smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. 20 years is a long time, he projected his voice, bouncing off the vaulted wooden ceilings. I told my accountant just yesterday, I think a man in my tax bracket is about ready to trade her in for a newer model. Laughter erupted, deep, hearty chuckles from his colleagues. Wives sitting nearby offered polite, uncomfortable titters, glancing at me through their eyelashes. Every eye in the room drifted toward my chair. I did not flinch. I felt the cold condensation beating on my champagne flute. The chill seeped into my fingertips, grounding me in the present moment. Instead of shrinking into my seat or letting tears prick my eyes, I raised my glass an inch, offering a flawless, icy smile. I spent 20 years assessing drought risks and crop yields. I knew how to weather a dry season. Crying or causing a scene would only give him the satisfaction of looking like the reasonable, level-headed half of our partnership. It would paint me as the hysterical wife unable to take a joke. Let them laugh, I thought. My jaw locked so tight my teeth ached, but my expression remained serene. The dinner wore on. The air grew stifling under the weight of that humiliation. The prime rib tasted like cardboard. The conversations around me blurred into a dull hum. Needing a moment to breathe real oxygen, I excused myself and walked toward the quiet expanse of the coat check near the lobby doors. The hallway was dim. the noise of the dining room muffled behind heavy velvet curtains. The cool draft from the front entrance washed over my face. As I turned the corner, a tall, distinguished man with silver hair brushed past me. His shoulder clipped mine just hard enough to force me to stop. "Pardon me, Mrs. Price," he said. His voice was low, carrying an unexpected gravity. He did not linger or offer a hand. He kept walking, disappearing into the cold night air before I could even process his face or ask how he knew my name. I smoothed the front of my dress, feeling a sudden, unnatural stiffness in my blazer pocket. Reaching inside, my fingers brushed against a piece of heavy cardstock. I pulled it out under the dim sconce light. It was a blank business card, devoid of any corporate logo or title. On the back, written in sharp, precise blue ink, were 2 sentences. "Check the Missouri River water rights filings. Call me." Below the text was a phone number and the initials E.T. My pulse, which had remained steady during my husband's public insult, finally kicked into a harsh rhythm against my throat. This was no prank. Miles's joke in the dining room suddenly cast a much darker shadow across our life. The declined credit card at the bar, the nervous tension in his jaw, the arrogant toast they began stringing together, hinting at a reality I had not yet uncovered. He was hiding a financial maneuver. Whoever this stranger was, he knew exactly where the secrets were buried. I slipped the card back into my pocket, smoothing my blazer one last time. When I walked back into the dining room, Miles was leaning back in his chair, laughing at another man's joke, looking entirely pleased with himself. I took my seat beside him, offering that same polished smile. He had no idea the game had just changed. The drive home stretched out across the dark asphalt like a black ribbon cutting through the rolling eastern prairies. Inside the cabin of Miles' luxury SUV, the silence pressed against my eardrums. Outside, the South Dakota night was vast and empty, devoid of streetlights or passing cars. The only sound was the hum of the tires and the rhythmic thud of the heater. I sat in the passenger seat, my eyes fixed on the illuminated dashboard. My hands rested in my lap, one thumb tracing the outline of the heavy cardstock hidden deep inside my blazer pocket. Miles hated quiet. He thrived on noise, on chatter, on controlling the auditory space in any room he occupied. I could see his reflection in the driver window. He tapped his fingers against the leather-wrapped steering wheel in erratic, restless rhythm. He was waiting for the explosion. He expected me to yell, to demand an apology for the humiliation he inflicted upon me during his toast. He wanted the fight, because a fight meant he could pivot and play the victim. "You are not still upset about that little joke, are you?" he finally asked. His tone dripped with casual dismissal, lacking even a fraction of genuine remorse. "It was just locker room talk, Aubrey. The guys expect a little self-deprecating humor. Do not be so sensitive." The audacity of his words tasted like copper in my mouth. A younger version of myself would have taken the bait. I would have raised my voice, listed every sacrifice I made for his career, and demanded basic respect. But confrontation without information is a strategic failure. The stranger at the coat check had handed me a thread, and if I engaged Miles now, he would realize I held it. I needed him comfortable. I needed him careless. I turned my head slowly, meeting his gaze as he briefly looked away from the road. I forced the muscles in my face to relax, offering a placid, understanding expression. "You are right," I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any sharp edges. "I am just tired from the event. It was a long night." Miles exhaled a loud breath, his shoulders dropping 2 inches as relief washed over him. He flashed me that boyish, charismatic grin that had charmed half the real estate developers in the state. "Good," he said, patting my knee. "Let us just get home and get some rest." I reached forward and turned the volume dial on the center console. A soft country ballad filled the interior, effectively killing any chance for further conversation. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, staring out into the starless night. I had just executed my first strategic move. I agreed with my enemy. We pulled into our driveway 40 minutes later. The gravel crunched beneath the heavy tires, signaling our arrival at the sprawling ranch-style home we built together. We walked through the front door in tandem. Miles kicked off his expensive dress shoes in the foyer, loosening his silk tie as he headed straight for the staircase. He did not look back. He did not offer a goodnight kiss. He operated under the assumption that the tension had been resolved. Within 30 minutes, the low, rhythmic sound of his snoring drifted down from the master bedroom. He slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who believed he held all the cards. I stood alone in the dark kitchen. The moonlight sliced through the wooden blinds, casting long, pale shadows across the granite countertops. I slipped my hand into my pocket and retrieved the business card. The initials E.T. stared back at me in the dim light. Check the Missouri River water rights filings. I walked softly down the hallway, bypassing the stairs and heading toward my home office. My workspace stood in stark contrast to his. Miles decorated his office with mahogany plush seating and framed photographs of his commercial ribbon cuttings. My office was utilitarian. The walls held framed topological maps of the Missouri River Basin and dry erase boards covered in agricultural zoning codes. I spent my days regulating crop yields, tracking soil erosion, and auditing farm subsidies. I knew how farmers hid extra acreage. I knew how corporations tried to bypass water restrictions. I understood data, and more importantly, I understood how people manipulated it. I sat down in my desk chair. The springs offered a faint squeak. I booted up my laptop. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, pale blue glow across my face. The antique grandfather clock in the foyer ticked with a steady, relentless cadence. Tick, tick. Each sound felt like a hammer striking an anvil. The man sleeping upstairs was deceiving me, and I was about to prove it. Instead of jumping straight into the state water rights database, I opened our joint banking portals. If Miles was executing a hidden financial maneuver, he needed capital. He needed a paper trail. I typed in my credentials, the clicking of the keyboard echoing in the silent room. The ledger loaded on the screen. I scrolled past the mundane expenses, the grocery runs, the utility bills, the mortgage payments. I ignored the ordinary debris of our shared life and focused on the negative space. I searched for anomalies. It took less than 10 minutes to find the first fracture. There it was, buried deep within the transaction history of our secondary checking account. Small, irregular, automated teller withdrawals. $200 here, $300 there. The dates varied, but a distinct pattern emerged. The withdrawals always occurred on a Tuesday or a Thursday, never exceeding the daily cash limit that might trigger a fraud alert. Over the past 4 months, the sum of those quiet withdrawals equated to several $1,000s of untraceable cash. I dug deeper, navigating to his business expense ledger, the one he claimed covered his client entertainment costs. My eyes scanned the rows of data, searching for the crack in the facade. A recurring charge caught my attention, repeating every other week like clockwork. Sioux Falls, a city 4 hours away from our quiet prairie town. Miles frequently claimed he traveled to the Black Hills for real estate scouting, yet these charges placed him on the opposite side of the state. The expenses were consistent: a high-end steakhouse, a luxury hotel near the downtown financial district, a prominent upscale boutique. I cross-referenced the dates of the Sioux Falls charges with our shared digital calendar. Every single transaction aligned perfectly with the days he told me he was attending all-day zoning meetings or inspecting commercial properties in remote counties. A cold chill settled into my chest. The declined credit card at the bar. The arrogant joke about trading me in for a newer model. The stranger at the coat check handing me a cryptic warning. The cash withdrawals and the phantom trips to Sioux Falls. The pieces began interlocking, forming a jagged, ugly picture. He was not just suffering a typical midlife crisis. He was not just wandering emotionally. The man I had spent 2 decades supporting, the man whose career I helped build, was actively siphoning our assets. He was funneling money into a separate life, orchestrating a plan that excluded me entirely. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing screen. I did not shed a single tear. The grief had not yet arrived. In its place, a sharp crystalline focus took hold. The illusion of my peaceful marriage was dead. The war had officially begun. The morning sun crested the horizon, painting the South Dakota frost in pale shades of gold. I sat at the kitchen island, nursing a cup of black coffee. The house was quiet. Miles had left 30 minutes earlier, his expensive cologne still lingering in the foyer. He kissed my cheek before walking out the door, reminding me to pick up his dry cleaning. It was a mundane domestic request. It was the performance of a man who believed his secrets were safe. The moment his car tires hit the paved county road, I abandoned my coffee. I walked straight into his home office and locked the heavy oak door behind me. The Sioux Falls credit card charges from the night before burned in my mind. I needed physical proof. I needed the receipts. Miles was meticulous, but arrogance breeds carelessness. I bypassed his locked filing cabinets and went directly to his leather briefcase tucked beneath the window seat. He rarely brought it into the house, unless he was rushing to review contracts before a morning meeting. My fingers worked the brass clasps. Inside the compartments held neatly stacked folders, architectural blueprints, and a sleek leather folio. I pulled the folio open. Tucked behind a stack of commercial zoning permits was a small cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed logo of a luxury boutique in downtown Sioux Falls. I slid the paper out. It was a printed receipt, dated 3 weeks prior. The merchant was a high-end jeweler known for custom pieces. The total charge was $12,000. The item description read simply, "Diamond solitaire pendant necklace, 18-karat white gold." My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the crisp black ink until the letters blurred. The joke he made during his anniversary toast echoed in my ears. "I am ready to trade her in for a newer model." I had assumed it was just a cruel, drunken attempt to impress his peers. Now staring at a $12,000 receipt for a diamond necklace I had never seen, the joke transformed into a literal confession. He had a mistress, a younger woman hidden away in Sioux Falls. He was taking her to expensive steakhouses and buying her custom jewelry while I stayed home auditing crop rotations and managing our household. A heavy, suffocating weight pressed down on my chest. I placed my palms flat on his desk, forcing myself to take slow, measured breaths. The instinct to weep rose in my throat, but I swallowed it down. Tears would not recover my dignity. Tears would not secure my future. I needed to understand exactly how much of our shared wealth he was bleeding into this secret romance. I placed the receipt back into the envelope and returned the folio to his briefcase exactly as I found it. I left the house an hour later, driving toward the commercial district of a neighboring county. I was not going to confront him. I was going to quantify the damage. I needed a professional. I needed someone devoid of emotion, someone who viewed marital betrayal strictly as a mathematical equation. I called Cameron. We crossed paths 5 years ago during a complex State Farm subsidy audit. Cameron was an independent forensic accountant who possessed a reputation for being brilliant and entirely unbothered by human drama. Cameron operated out of a sterile, windowless office building, flanked by an accounting firm and a dental clinic. I walked through the glass doors at noon. The air inside the office smelled of ozone and fresh printer paper. Cameron sat behind a minimalist metal desk wearing a charcoal blazer, eyes fixed on a glowing dual monitor setup. There were no framed family photos. There were no decorative plants. The space was an altar to cold, hard data. "Take a seat," Aubrey Cameron said, not looking away from the screen. I sat in the rigid guest chair and pulled a manila folder from my tote bag. I slid it across the metal surface. It contained printouts of the joint bank statements I accessed the night before, along with a photograph I took of the jewelry receipt. "My husband is having an affair," I said, keeping my voice level. "He is funneling cash out of our secondary accounts, and he bought a $12,000 diamond necklace in Sioux Falls. I need you to trace the rest of his personal spending. I need to know how much this woman is costing us before I file the divorce papers." Cameron finally looked up. The accountant picked up the photograph of the receipt, glanced at it for 2 seconds, and tossed it back onto the desk like a piece of useless trash. Then Cameron opened my bank statements. The silence in the room stretched for 10 agonizing minutes. The only sound was the rapid clicking of a mouse and the soft hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. I watched Cameron type strings of commands into an auditing software program. My anxiety hummed beneath my skin. I braced myself to hear the final tally of his romantic weekends and lavish gifts. "You are focused on the wrong numbers," Cameron finally said, leaning back in the chair. I frowned, gripping the armrests. "What do you mean?" "The cash withdrawals, the jewelry. It is right there." Cameron steepled both hands together, offering a gaze devoid of any pity. "That receipt is a rounding error. It is a distraction. Your husband is not bleeding your accounts to fund a romance. He is using the jewelry and the hotel stays as a smokescreen to hide a much larger financial hemorrhage." A cold dread pooled in my stomach. I leaned forward. "Explain it to me." Cameron rotated one of the monitors toward me. A complex spreadsheet filled the screen, highlighting a series of wire transfers spanning the last 8 months. The origin accounts were not our checking or savings. They were the agricultural holding accounts. Those accounts held the generational wealth from my family farm. My grandfather worked that South Dakota soil until his hands bled, building a legacy that I swore to protect. When Miles and I married, I trusted him to manage the liquid assets while I handled the regulatory compliance. It was the foundation of our partnership. "Look at the routing numbers," Cameron instructed, tapping a pen against the glass screen. "He has been systematically siphoning capital out of your family trust. He moves the funds in increments just under the federal reporting threshold to avoid triggering an automatic bank audit. He transfers the money into a holding account, sanitizes it through a series of shell transactions, and pushes it out of state." My mouth went dry. "How much?" Cameron adjusted a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. "Based on this preliminary trace, he has moved $450,000 since January." The air vanished from the room. $450,000. The number defied logic. It defied reality. The diamond necklace was a trivial trinket compared to the monumental theft occurring right beneath my nose. My husband was not just cheating on me. He was stripping my family legacy down to the studs. "Where is the money going?" I asked, my voice dropping to a hollow whisper. "Is he giving it to her?" Cameron shook his head, pulling up a new document on the screen. It was a corporate registration record from a neighboring state. "The funds are not going to an individual," Cameron stated, delivering the final, devastating blow. "The money is being funneled directly into a corporate entity, a limited liability company. Your husband is pooling your generational wealth to capitalize a corporate acquisition. The stakes of my reality shifted in an instant. The ground beneath my feet dissolved. I walked into that office as a heartbroken wife looking for evidence of infidelity. I was sitting there now as a target of a corporate liquidation. Miles was not distracted by a younger woman. He was executing a calculated, predatory financial exit strategy. He intended to leave me destitute, robbing me of the very land my family bled for. I stared at the glowing monitor, the columns of stolen money reflecting in my eyes. The hurt evaporated. The humiliation from the anniversary party vanished. A deep, freezing rage took its place, hardening my spine into steel. He thought I was just a naive compliance officer. He thought he could steal my legacy and trade me in without a fight. "I need the name of the company," I said to Cameron. "I need to know exactly who he is building this empire with." Cameron printed the corporate registration and slid the warm paper across the metal desk. The document listed a registered agent, a name that would lead me straight into the heart of his shadow empire. I stared at the warm paper resting on the metal desk. The black ink outlined a corporate registration for an entity named Prairie Horizon Holdings. My eyes scanned the lines of rigid legal text, searching for the logic behind the betrayal. I built my career enforcing rules, finding the truth hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic red tape. Yet, sitting in this sterile office, the data staring back at me felt like a foreign language. "How did he bypass my office?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy with professional shame. I managed agricultural compliance for the entire Central District. Any land acquisition involving Missouri River water rights or generational farming acreage required my explicit approval. I reviewed the deeds. I authorized the zoning shifts. I knew every acre of fertile soil and every struggling farm within a 100-mile radius. Miles could not buy a single plot of land in our district without the paperwork crossing my desk. Cameron did not offer a comforting smile. The accountant turned back to the dual monitors, fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. A digital map of South Dakota materialized on the left screen. Red boundary lines sliced the state into counties, separating the rolling eastern prairies from the rugged terrain of the Black Hills. "He did not file in your district," Cameron stated, tracing a pen along the glowing border. He utilized a shadow jurisdiction. The pen tapped against a highlighted zone just outside my regulatory reach. "He registered Prairie Horizon Holdings, one county over," Cameron explained. "The registered office sits across the jurisdictional line. By establishing the corporate entity outside your immediate oversight, he insulated the financial maneuvering from your daily audits. The paperwork never crossed your desk because he ensured the legal address belonged to a neighboring municipality." A sickening realization washed over me. The boundary lines on the screen mocked my years of diligent public service. I spent thousands of hours reviewing topographical maps, ensuring corporate entities adhered to environmental regulations. By moving his operations just 14 miles east, Miles stepped out of my regulatory sunlight and into the bureaucratic shadows. He exploited the very system I dedicated my life to upholding. The betrayal was not merely financial. It was highly professional. Miles studied my daily routines. He understood the exact limits of my authority and mapped the blind spots in my jurisdiction. He weaponized my own career constraints against me, operating just inches outside my field of vision. Cameron opened another folder on the desktop, the screen filled with scanned legal documents. They were property deeds, dozens of them. "He is using the funds siphoned from your family trust to acquire independent farms," Cameron said, zooming in on a signature line. He targets landowners facing impending foreclosures or consecutive dry yields. I leaned closer to the monitor, my chest tightening. I recognized the names on those deeds. These were not faceless corporate entities. These were my neighbors. I saw the signature of a man who supplied our local farmers market for 30 years. I saw the name of a widow whose husband I helped navigate federal crop subsidies a decade ago. The names represented decades of shared history. I recalled summer evenings sitting on wraparound porches discussing crop yields and unpredictable weather patterns. These were families who survived droughts, blizzards, and economic downturns. They held on to their soil with a fierce, stubborn pride that defined the frontier spirit of this state. For Miles to target them, to exploit their financial vulnerabilities during a lean harvest season, required a level of cold calculation I never recognized in the man I married. My stomach churned. These people despised commercial developers. They spent their lives fighting against corporate conglomerates trying to pave over their heritage. They would never willingly sell their generational land to a slick real estate broker like Miles. Why are they signing? I demanded, gripping the edge of the desk so hard my fingernails bit into my own palms. Miles represents everything they hate. Cameron remained silent for a long moment, pulling up the addendum attached to the latest purchase agreement. The accountant highlighted a specific paragraph buried deep within the legal jargon. "Because they trust you," Cameron replied evenly. I read the highlighted text. The words blurred, then sharpened, cutting into me like a physical blade. The contract included a specialized contingency clause. It guaranteed that the newly acquired land would remain compliant with the strict agricultural conservation standards established by my personal consulting firm. "He is using your name," Cameron said, verifying the nightmare unfolding in my mind. "He approaches these vulnerable families and leverages your pristine reputation in the community. He assures them the land will be protected under your guidelines. He acts as a proxy, convincing them that selling to his holding company is practically the same as entrusting the land to you." The air in the office felt too thin to breathe. The true scale of the deception crystallized, shattering the last remaining fragments of the life I thought I knew. Miles was not just stealing my generational wealth. He was stealing my integrity. He used the trust I spent 20 years building to execute a predatory land grab, stripping my neighbors of their livelihoods while draining my family trust to fund the initial capital. To him, our marriage was not a sacred bond. It was a corporate liquidation. I was merely an asset to be leveraged, a brand name to be exploited to secure signatures on fraudulent contracts. I closed my eyes. The scent of ozone and warm electronics filled my senses. I felt a cold, calculated clarity replace the rising panic. The man sleeping in my bed, the man who joked about trading me in for a newer model, was orchestrating the systematic destruction of my entire community. I opened my eyes and looked at Cameron. The accountant sat perfectly still, awaiting my instruction. "Show me the registered agent," I commanded, my voice devoid of any tremor. "Show me exactly who is running this shadow entity for him." Cameron clicked a tab on the right monitor, pulling up the state incorporation documents for Prairie Horizon Holdings. The paperwork detailed the corporate structure. Miles was listed as a silent capital backer. The managing director, the person holding the legal authority to execute these predatory acquisitions, was listed boldly at the bottom of the page. "Her name is Paige Cameron," stated, tapping the screen. I stared at the name. It felt sharp, clinical, and dangerous. Cameron pulled up a corresponding professional profile. A high-resolution photograph appeared on the screen. Paige was 30 years old, possessing the polished, ruthless demeanor of a corporate mercenary. She wore a tailored blazer and a sharp, calculating smile. Her title identified her as a senior acquisitions director for a formidable agricultural conglomerate headquartered out of state. The screen displayed her credentials. She boasted a degree from a prestigious East Coast university far removed from the dirt and sweat of our agricultural reality. Her biography highlighted her expertise in asset consolidation and distressed property acquisition. She was not someone who understood the value of a family farm. She viewed acres of fertile earth as nothing more than lines on a ledger ready to be carved up, repackaged, and sold to the highest bidder. She is not a romantic distraction, Cameron noted, reading the employment history. She is a closer. Her firm specializes in absorbing distressed rural properties, liquidating the assets, and selling the water rights to commercial developers. The puzzle pieces snapped into place with terrifying precision. The $12,000 diamond necklace, the expensive steakhouses in Sioux Falls, the frequent trips disguised as property inspections. Miles was not courting a lover. He was courting a corporate merger. Page provided the ruthless infrastructure he needed to execute the land grab, while my drained marital funds served as the down payment. I memorized the address listed on Page's corporate profile. It was an upscale commercial building in the heart of downtown Sioux Falls. I needed to see her. I needed to witness the dynamic between the man destroying my life and the woman facilitating the execution. I gathered the printed documents from the metal desk and slid them carefully into my manila folder. My hands did not shake. The emotional devastation was entirely eclipsed by the strategic necessity of dismantling their corporate blueprint. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my trousers. "Do not stop digging," I told Cameron. "I want every routing number, every hidden account, and every property deed tied to that conglomerate. Find the bottom of this hole." Cameron gave a brief, singular nod. The accountant had already turned back to the glowing monitors before I reached the office door. I walked out into the bright South Dakota afternoon. The cold prairie wind whipped across the parking lot, biting at my cheeks. I retrieved my car keys from my pocket, my fingers brushing against the heavy business card Elias Thorne had handed me the night before. Check the Missouri River water rights filings. The stranger at the anniversary party knew the depth of the rot. But before I could call him, before I could build the trap to catch my husband, I needed to observe the enemy in her natural habitat. I needed to look the newer model in the eye. I started the engine, shifting the vehicle into gear, and turned the steering wheel toward the highway leading to Sioux Falls. The drive east along Interstate 90 offered nothing but flat horizon and pale sky. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel, the engine humming a steady rhythm beneath the floorboards. Sioux Falls rose from the prairie like a sudden eruption of glass and steel, a stark contrast to the quiet farm roads I knew so well. I navigated the busy downtown streets, pulling into the subterranean parking garage of the Grand Executive Hotel. The digital marquee outside advertised the annual Midwest Commercial Real Estate Symposium. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I wore a tailored navy suit, the kind I used for testifying at state agricultural hearings. I pulled my hair back into a severe knot, applying a neutral shade of lipstick. I looked like just another mid-level developer attending a breakout session. I grabbed my leather tote bag and walked toward the elevators. The air in the garage smelled of exhaust and damp concrete. The hotel convention level buzzed with suited professionals holding ceramic coffee cups and glossy brochures. I kept my head down, blending into the crowd moving toward Conference Room B. The placard beside the double oak doors read, "Optimizing Distressed Rural Assets." I slipped into the room just as the heavy doors clicked shut, taking a seat in the back row. The lighting was dimmed, directing all attention to the brightly lit stage at the front. A woman stood behind the podium. It was Paige. Seeing her in person felt different than staring at a digital photograph on a forensic accountant monitor. She wore a sharp, bone-white blazer that stood out starkly against the dark velvet curtains behind her. She did not pace. She did not fidget. She planted herself behind the microphone with the stillness of a predator waiting for the wind to change. Her voice carried over the sound system, crisp, measured, and entirely devoid of warmth. We are looking at a unique transitional window in the regional agricultural sector, Page told the audience. Generational properties are facing unprecedented liquidity crises. For the agile investor, these distressed parcels represent an untapped acquisition vector. She clicked a remote in her hand. A slide appeared on the screen behind her, displaying a graph with steep downward trends. I felt a sick knot tighten in my stomach. She was talking about foreclosure. She was talking about families who could not afford seed or fertilizer after 2 bad harvest seasons. She called their generational suffering an untapped acquisition vector. I watched her field questions from the audience. A gray-haired man in the third row asked about the complexities of local water rights zoning. Page did not hesitate. She dismantled his concern with surgical precision, citing obscure municipal loopholes and expedited rezoning tactics. She possessed a terrifying command of the legal framework required to strip a farm down to its bare dirt. She was not a careless amateur. She was a corporate mercenary, highly trained, and exceptionally dangerous. The session concluded to a round of polite applause. The house lights flared bright. I remained seated, adjusting my glasses and pretending to review a brochure I grabbed from the registration table. The crowd filtered out, moving toward the lobby for the scheduled networking break. I waited until the room was nearly empty before standing and following the trail of attendees. The lobby was a sprawling expanse of marble floors, potted palms, and gold-accented seating areas. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans and expensive floral perfume. I positioned myself near a towering structural pillar, shielded by a broad-leafed decorative plant, offering a clear view of the primary lounge area. Page stood near a tall cocktail table, accepting business cards and offering tight, practiced smiles to a few lingering developers. She checked her gold wristwatch, a subtle dismissal that sent the remaining men walking toward the buffet tables. She stood alone, her eyes scanning the grand entrance. A moment later, the revolving glass doors spun. Miles walked into the lobby. My breath caught in my chest. He wore his favorite charcoal suit, the one he claimed he only brought out for closing major deals. He spotted Page immediately. He did not run his hands through his hair or straighten his tie. He moved toward her with a brisk, purposeful stride. I braced myself. A part of me, the lingering remnant of the wife who believed in 20 years of marriage, braced for the physical confirmation of a romantic affair. I prepared to witness the lingering touch, the intimate lean, the secret smile shared between lovers. He stopped 3 feet away from her. The distance was professional, sterile. Page did not smile. She offered a curt nod, reaching into the oversized leather bag resting on the floor beside her. She retrieved a thick, unmarked manila folder and handed it to him. Miles accepted the document, flipping it open to inspect the contents. His eyes darted across the pages. He pointed to a specific line of text, his brow furrowing in concentration. Page replied with a short, dismissive wave of her hand, clarifying whatever issue he raised. There was no warmth. There was no affection. Their interaction held all the intimacy of an automated teller machine dispensing cash. Miles closed the folder, tucking it securely under his arm. He checked his phone, typed a rapid message, and looked back at Page. She gave him another brief nod, already turning her attention back toward the convention hall doors. Miles turned on his heel and walked back toward the revolving glass entrance. The entire exchange lasted less than 2 minutes. I stood frozen behind the marble pillar, the realization sinking into my bones. The diamond necklace was a prop. The expensive hotel stays were strategic cover stories. He used the facade of an affair because an affair is a predictable, manageable sin in our society. People expect men to cheat. They do not expect men to systematically liquidate their wives to fund a shadow corporate merger. Paige was not the other woman. She was the infrastructure. She provided the legal framework the shell companies and the corporate backing required to execute the land grab. Miles provided the capital drained secretly from my family trust and the local influence needed to secure the vulnerable farms. They were business partners, engaged in a hostile takeover of my life. The last lingering trace of grief evaporated, burned away by the cold reality of his betrayal. Mourning a marriage requires the belief that the marriage still existed. Watching Miles walk out of that hotel lobby with the manila folder, I understood that my husband died years ago, replaced by a ruthless financial operator who viewed me as nothing more than an obstacle to be managed. I waited until Paige disappeared back into the conference rooms before stepping out from behind the pillar. I walked across the marble floor with steady, measured steps. My hands did not tremble. The sting of rejection was gone, replaced by the icy, calculating logic I used to audit fraudulent crop reports. They believed they were operating in the shadows. They believed my focus was limited to soil erosion and water compliance limits. They underestimated the tenacity of a woman raised on the prairie. A woman who understood that surviving a brutal winter required careful preparation and a willingness to let the weak things freeze. I pushed through the revolving glass doors, stepping back into the biting wind of the Sioux Falls afternoon. I pulled my coat tight against the chill and walked toward the parking garage. The defensive phase of my investigation was over. I quantified the financial damage. I identified the corporate mercenary orchestrating the theft. Now I needed to build the guillotine. I slid into the driver's seat of my car and locked the doors. The leather interior was cold. I reached into my tote bag and retrieved the heavy, unmarked business card the silver-haired stranger handed me at the anniversary party. I traced the initials E.T. with my thumb. He told me to check the Missouri River water rights filings. He knew Paige was acquiring the land. He knew Miles was funding it. Most importantly, he knew I possessed the internal regulatory access to stop them both. I placed my phone on the center console and dialed the number written in blue ink. The line rang twice before a deep, resonant voice answered. "I have been expecting your call, Mrs. Price," the man said. "My name is Aubrey," I replied, my voice hard and clear. "I know about Prairie Horizon Holdings. I know about the corporate acquisitions, and I want to know exactly how we are going to tear them down." "Let us meet," Elias Thorne said. "There is a diner near the river on Highway 47. I will be there in an hour." I ended the call, the screen going dark. The engine roared to life. I shifted the car into gear, the tires squealing faintly against the concrete as I navigated toward the exit. The pieces were on the board, and the game was no longer being played in the dark. I was going to let my husband build his fragile glass empire right up until the final moment, and then I was going to shatter it. The highway unspooled like a frayed gray ribbon alongside the dark, muscular currents of the Missouri River. I drove with the heater blasting, but the chill inside the cabin had nothing to do with the South Dakota winter. My mind categorized the data I gathered in Sioux Falls, sorting the corporate espionage from the marital treason. The landscape outside my window shifted from urban sprawl back to the desolate, rolling eastern prairies. I pulled my sedan into the gravel parking lot of a solitary roadside diner. The neon sign above the entrance flickered, casting a bruised purple light over the hood of my car. The wind coming off the water carried the scent of frozen mud and impending snow. I pushed through the heavy glass door. The interior smelled of burnt coffee and frying bacon. The diner was nearly empty, occupied only by a long-haul trucker at the counter and a waitress wiping down a sticky syrup dispenser. I scanned the booths lining the back wall. Elias Thorne sat in the corner, nursing a ceramic mug, He wore a heavy wool coat over a faded flannel shirt. He looked like a man who spent his entire life outdoors, yet he possessed the sharp, evaluating gaze of a seasoned judge. I walked the length of the linoleum floor, my boots scuffing the faded checkered tiles, and slid into the cracked vinyl seat across from him. He did not offer a handshake. He pushed a secondary mug of black coffee across the table toward me. Steam curled from the dark surface. "You went to Sioux Falls," he stated. His tone held no question. He simply knew. I wrapped my fingers around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into my skin. "I saw her," I replied, keeping my voice level. I watched my husband hand over a corporate file to a woman who specializes in distressed rural asset acquisition. Elias took a slow sip of his coffee. His silver hair caught the dim overhead light. "For the past 12 years, I served as a senior state agricultural regulator for this region," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I spent my final decade watching out-of-state conglomerates swallow independent farms, stripping the water rights and leaving the local economies to wither. The firm employing the woman you saw today is the most ruthless predator I ever tracked." I studied his face. The deep lines around his eyes spoke of a career spent fighting losing battles against corporate lawyers and political lobbyists. "Why approach me at an anniversary party?" I asked. "Why use a cryptic note instead of calling my office?" "Because your husband insulated his operation beautifully," Elias explained, leaning forward. "My former colleagues at the state level know a hostile consolidation is occurring in your district. We see the shell companies forming. We see the predatory contracts trapping vulnerable landowners. But the paperwork looks pristine. The corporate entity utilizes a neighboring jurisdiction to avoid triggering a direct audit. On paper, it appears to be a legitimate series of private land sales. We lack the internal mechanism to prove fraud." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle between us. "Then I realized who the primary capital backer was," Elias continued. "Miles is the perfect local proxy. He possesses the commercial real estate license and, more importantly, he possesses you. Your reputation in this community is flawless, Aubrey. The farmers trust your judgment. When your husband approaches them promising their generational acreage will remain compliant under your stringent conservation guidelines, they sign the deeds. He is using your name as a shield to orchestrate a corporate slaughter." I looked away from his piercing gaze, turning my attention to the diner window. The rolling prairies stretched out toward the horizon, a sea of dormant winter wheat beneath a pale, unforgiving sky. My chest tightened as a visceral memory surfaced, sharp and uninvited. I was 12 years old, standing on the warped wooden porch of my family homestead. The bank representative wore a cheap suit and carried a pristine leather briefcase. My grandfather stood beside me on the porch steps. His hands were rough as tree bark stained permanently with topsoil and machine grease. He watched in silence as the banker hammered the foreclosure notice into our wooden front gate. That land held 3 generations of our blood, our sweat, and our survival. To my grandfather, the farm was a living, breathing entity. It was a legacy built on calloused hands and unpredictable harvests. He died a year later, his heart giving out after moving into a cramped, sterile townhome. The medical examiner cited cardiac arrest. I knew the truth. He died of a severed root. To men like that banker, and to men like my husband, the soil was not a legacy. The land was just dirt. It was merely a line item on a ledger, an asset waiting for liquidation. Miles viewed my family trust, the money generated from the sale of our remaining acreage, as nothing more than a convenient down payment for his shadow empire. The memory fueled the cold fire burning inside my ribs. I turned my attention back to Elias. "What do you need from me?" I asked, my voice devoid of any hesitation. "I need the internal compliance codes." Elias answered, his eyes locking onto mine. I need the regulatory bypass authorizations he filed. I need you to untangle the bureaucratic knot he tied. If we can prove he forged compliance documents to secure the initial bridge loans, the state can step in. We can freeze the escrow accounts and halt the acquisitions before the final closing date. But I cannot access that data from the outside. I took a slow breath, tasting the bitter coffee on my tongue. I already initiated a forensic audit of our joint accounts, I told him. I hired an independent accountant named Cameron. We traced the stolen marital funds directly into the corporate shell company managing the land grab. We possessed the financial routing numbers. A glint of predatory satisfaction flashed in Elias' eyes. He tapped a calloused finger against the Formica tabletop. The regulator, the accountant, and the compliance officer, Elias mused, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. We are going to build an airtight paper trail. We will document every stolen dollar, every forged signature, and every fraudulent zoning shift. We will construct a legal trap so dense your husband will never find the edges. I nodded, feeling the triad form in that quiet roadside diner. It was an alliance of unfeeling, methodical professionals united by a singular goal. We were not seeking a tearful confession or a messy divorce settlement. We were engineering a total corporate destruction. There is one critical element you must understand, Elias warned, his expression sobering. Building a federal injunction requires meticulous documentation. It demands time. We need at least 4 weeks to secure the trap wire. During that period, your husband cannot suspect a single thing. If he senses an audit, he will accelerate the closing date and wire the funds out of state. I understood the terrifying implication of his words. The defensive phase of my investigation was over. The trap construction phase had begun. You must go back to your house, Elias said softly. You must cook his dinner, ask about his day, and smile while he plans your financial ruin. You must be the perfect, oblivious wife. Can you do that? I thought about the anniversary toast. I thought about the $12,000 diamond necklace. I thought about my grandfather watching a stranger hammer a sign into his front gate. I stood up, pulling a few crumpled dollar bills from my pocket and tossing them onto the table to cover the coffee. I spent 20 years enforcing compliance rules, I told Elias. I know exactly how to play the game. I walked out of the diner, the wind whipping my hair across my face. I unlocked my car and gripped the steering wheel, staring at the empty highway leading back to my house. The true psychological toll of this war loomed before me. I had to return to the man plotting my demise and offer him my throat, trusting that my hidden armor would hold. I turned the ignition, the engine roaring against the silence of the prairie, and drove toward the ultimate performance. The key to surviving a hostile environment is adapting to the ambient temperature. When I returned home from the roadside diner, I adjusted the thermostat in my mind, dropping the temperature until every raw emotion froze solid. I walked into my house not as a betrayed wife, but as a spy operating behind enemy lines. The structure of my life had not changed. The furniture remained exactly where I placed it. The kitchen smelled faintly of vanilla and lemon polish. Yet the air felt dense, heavy with the suffocating weight of the performance I was about to begin. Miles arrived home an hour later. He walked through the front door, humming a low, upbeat tune. He hung his expensive wool coat in the hall closet and loosened his tie, the picture of a man entirely at ease with the universe. I stood at the kitchen island slicing vegetables for dinner. The rhythmic thwack of the knife against the wooden cutting board provided a steady metronome for my racing heart. "Something smells incredible," he said, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind. He pressed a kiss to my cheek. His skin was warm. He smelled of mint and the cold prairie air. 2 days ago, that gesture would have felt like a comforting routine, a testament to 2 decades of shared history. Now, it felt like a tactical maneuver. He was managing an asset. He was keeping the livestock calm before leading it to the slaughterhouse. I leaned back into his embrace, forcing the muscles in my shoulders to relax. "I am making the garlic butter steak you like," I replied, my voice smooth and untroubled. "How was the office today?" "Productive," he answered, letting me go and walking toward the wine fridge. "Very productive. We are close to finalizing the details on that big commercial tract in the next county over. It has been a logistical nightmare, but the payoff is going to be astronomical." He pulled a bottle of expensive red wine from the rack and reached for the corkscrew. The irony of his statement was almost too brilliant to endure. He was standing in my kitchen drinking my wine, boasting about the hostile corporate takeover he was funding with my family money. I watched him pour the dark liquid into 2 crystal glasses, the deep crimson catching the light like fresh blood. He slid a glass across the marble counter toward me. "To hard work finally paying off," he toasted, raising his glass. I picked up my glass, tapping the rim lightly against his. "To the payoff," I echoed, taking a slow sip. The wine tasted bitter, but I swallowed it down. We sat across from each other in the formal dining room. The ambient lighting cast a warm golden glow over the mahogany table. It was the perfect stage setting for the domestic theater he required. I ate my dinner, nodding attentively as he launched into a monologue about interest rates and zoning regulations. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he was the smartest person in any room. I studied his face. I looked for a flicker of guilt, a micro-expression of hesitation, or some small sign that the man I married was still buried somewhere beneath the corporate mercenary. There was nothing. His eyes were clear and bright. He ate his steak with evident enjoyment. He was entirely untroubled by the fact that he was actively destroying my future to finance his own. "You know," he said, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin, "we have been running ourselves ragged lately. Between your agricultural audits and this massive deal I am pushing through, we barely have time to breathe." I set my fork down, resting my hands in my lap. "We do work hard," I agreed neutrally. Miles leaned across the table, a sudden spark of boyish excitement lighting up his features. "I was looking at flights today. Once this deal closes next month, the commission is going to be staggering. I think we should take a trip. A real vacation." "A trip," I repeated, ensuring my tone conveyed mild, pleasant surprise. "Europe," he declared, sweeping his hand through the air as if painting the itinerary. 2 weeks in Italy. Maybe rent a villa in Tuscany. Drink wine on a terrace overlooking the vineyards. You deserve a break, Aubrey. You deserve to be pampered." The audacity of his lie was breathtaking. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He was dangling the promise of a romantic European vacation to keep me docile, distracted by daydreams of Italian villas, while he finalized the paperwork that would leave me destitute. He knew I loved Italy. We talked about visiting for years, always pushing it off for another harvest season, another zoning battle. He was weaponizing my own dreams to ensure my compliance during the critical final weeks of his corporate heist. "That sounds wonderful," I said, offering a bright, convincing smile. "A villa in Tuscany sounds perfect." His grin widened, satisfied that the bait had been taken. "I will have my assistant start looking into rentals tomorrow," he promised, reaching across the table to cover my hand with his. I did not pull away. I let his hand rest over mine. His skin felt like sandpaper against my own. The psychological toll of weaponized patience is a heavy burden. It requires a daily, hourly commitment to self-denial. I had to validate his ego. I had to sleep beside him in the dark, listening to him breathe, knowing he was dreaming of an exit strategy that did not include me. I had to participate in a shared reality that I knew was entirely fabricated. Every word out of his mouth was a calculated lie, designed to manage my expectations until the closing date. But he was not the only one operating in the shadows. He believed he was managing an oblivious wife. He did not know that the woman smiling back at him had already initiated a forensic audit allied with a state regulator and located his corporate mercenary in Sioux Falls. He was planning a European vacation. I was planning a federal injunction. The evening dragged on, a suffocating charade of domestic bliss. We moved to the living room. Miles turned on a muted baseball game, stretching his legs out on the leather sofa. I sat beside him, reviewing a stack of legitimate agricultural compliance reports to maintain the illusion of my normal routine. My phone buzzed silently in my blazer pocket. I slipped it out, shielding the screen from his view. It was a text message from Cameron. Initial trace complete. Found a secondary vulnerability in the holding company structure. Call me tomorrow from a secure line. I read the message twice, committing the information to memory, and then deleted it entirely. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Everything okay? Miles asked, glancing over from the television. Just a local farmer asking about soil erosion limits. I lied smoothly, not missing a beat. The spring thaw is causing some runoff issues near the river. Miles chuckled, shaking his head. You worry too much about dirt, Aubrey. Let them figure it out. I smiled, turning back to my reports. I am just doing my job, I told him. The night wore on, a slow, agonizing countdown. I waited for the hours to pass, waiting for him to grow tired and retreat to the master bedroom. I needed him asleep. The defensive phase of the investigation was complete. Elias Thorne demanded internal compliance codes and regulatory bypass authorizations. To secure those documents, I had to breach the inner sanctum of my husband's shadow operation. I needed to access his home office. I needed the hard drive holding the blueprints to his corporate empire, and I needed to extract the data while he slept, oblivious to the fact that the wife he planned to discard was actively dismantling the trap he built around her. The drive back from Sioux Falls felt longer than the drive there. The barren landscape offered no comfort, just endless miles of frostbitten prairie stretching under a bruised winter sky. I kept my hands firmly at 10 and 2, the rhythm of the highway settling the frantic energy humming beneath my skin. I had located the mercenary. I had aligned with the regulator. Now, I needed the weapon. Saturday morning arrived, wrapped in pale sunlight and biting wind. The rhythmic thud of Miles jogging down the gravel driveway echoed through the frosted glass of the front door. Weekends were his designated fitness hours, a routine he adhered to with religious fervor. I stood by the kitchen window, watching his breath form white clouds in the crisp air. He wore premium thermal running gear, looking every bit the successful developer, maintaining his peak physical condition. I waited until his silhouette disappeared past the property line before walking to the hall closet. I reached into the pocket of my winter coat and pulled out a sleek silver external solid-state drive. I purchased it 2 days prior from an electronics store 3 towns over, paying in cash. Elias Thorne had been very clear during our diner meeting. Financial routing numbers were sufficient to prove intent, but to secure a federal injunction, we needed the raw, unredacted corporate blueprints. We needed the internal communications between Miles and his corporate partner, Paige. Those files resided on a specific piece of hardware. I needed to copy his primary workstation. 30 minutes later, the front door unlatched. Miles stepped inside, his face flushed, chest heaving. He dropped his keys onto the credenza, the metal jingling loudly in the quiet foyer. That wind is brutal today, he announced, peeling off his gloves. I am going to take a long, hot shower. Do we have any plans before noon? Nothing pressing, I replied smoothly, wiping down the already spotless granite countertop with a damp cloth. "Take your time. I am just going to catch up on some laundry." He grabbed a bottle of water from the refrigerator and headed for the stairs. A few moments later, the familiar rumble of the second-floor plumbing vibrated through the ceiling. The rush of water cascading through the pipes signaled the beginning of my operational window. He usually spent 20 minutes under the spray, followed by another 10 minutes shaving. Half an hour. It was a narrow margin, but it had to be enough. I abandoned the dishcloth and walked directly to his home office. My pulse drummed a steady, heavy beat against my ribs. I turned the brass knob and slipped inside, shutting the heavy oak door behind me. The room smelled of polished mahogany and expensive leather. The morning light filtered through the wooden blinds, casting horizontal shadows across his expansive desk. His laptop sat closed in the center of the leather blotter. I pressed the power button. The screen flared to life, casting a stark white glow over my face. A password prompt appeared. For a brief second, doubt fluttered in my chest. If he had changed his credentials recently, this entire mission would fail. I typed in the zip code of his first $1 million commercial zoning victory, followed by his birth year. He was a creature of profound ego. It was the only code he ever used for his personal devices. The screen unlocked, revealing his digital desktop. I exhaled a tight breath and plugged the silver drive into the USB port. I navigated to the local directory, locating the master folder labeled with the current calendar year. Inside were dozens of subfolders containing contracts, appraisals, and legal drafts. I selected the entire directory and dragged it over to the external drive icon. A dialog box popped up. Calculating time remaining. The progress bar materialized a thin green line crawling across the screen. Estimated time, 18 minutes. My stomach tightened. 18 minutes of data transfer, leaving me a 12-minute buffer. It was tight, but manageable. I stood beside the desk, my eyes locked on the digital percentage. 5%. 10%. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the soft, rhythmic hum of the laptop cooling fan. Above me, the water continued to run, a reassuring waterfall of white noise. I focused on deep, steady breaths, drawing the cool air into my lungs. I was not a terrified wife. I was a professional auditor extracting evidence of a crime. At 50%, the floorboards overhead groaned. My head snapped upward. The white noise of the shower abruptly died. The sudden silence was a physical shock. He had turned the water off early. 10 minutes too early. A fresh wave of adrenaline flooded my veins, making my fingertips tingle. I stared at the progress bar. 62%. It was moving too slowly. Footsteps padded across the ceiling, moving from the master bathroom toward the walk-in closet. He was drying off. He was getting dressed. I gripped the edge of the desk. My mind raced through the permutations of getting caught. If he walked in and saw the external drive plugged into his machine, the facade would shatter instantly. He would know I was hunting him. He would call his lawyers, move the money offshore, and initiate the divorce on his terms, leaving me with nothing but legal fees and empty bank accounts. 75%. The footsteps overhead moved toward the bedroom door. The heavy tread descended the upper half of the wooden staircase. Thud, thud, thud. 88%. I reached for the silver drive, my hand hovering just millimeters above the metal casing. If I pulled it now, the data would corrupt. The entire morning would be wasted, and I might not get another chance before his deal closed. 94%. He reached the landing. I heard him pause, probably checking his phone or adjusting his watch. The green bar on the screen crawled at an agonizing pace. 98%. His footsteps resumed moving down the hallway toward the kitchen. He would notice I was not at the sink. he would look for me. The home office was the next logical room. 100%. Transfer complete. I yanked the silver drive from the port, shoving it deep into the pocket of my trousers. I slammed the laptop shut, ensuring the lid clicked securely into place. I spun away from the desk just as the brass doorknob began to turn. I snatched a stack of folded linen napkins from a decorative side table, holding them casually in front of me. The heavy oak door swung inward. Miles stood in the threshold, wearing fresh jeans and a fitted sweater, his hair still damp from the shower. He stopped, his eyebrows drawing together in mild confusion. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his gaze darting from my face to his desk and back again. I offered a smooth, unbothered smile, stepping toward him. "I was just putting away these napkins in the credenza," I lied, my voice steady and light. "I noticed the cleaning service missed dusting the baseboards in here last week. I was checking to see if I need to call the agency and complain." He relaxed, the suspicion melting away, replaced by his usual arrogant dismissal of domestic chores. "Do not bother complaining," he said, stepping aside to let me pass. "Just hire a new service. We can afford it." I walked past him, the silver drive burning a hole in my pocket. "I will look into it on Monday," I replied, heading toward the kitchen without looking back. 2 hours later, Miles left the house to meet a contractor at a commercial site. The moment his vehicle cleared the driveway, I retreated to my own office and locked the door. I pulled the silver drive from my pocket and plugged it into my secure workstation. I needed to see exactly what I had stolen. I opened the copied directory, navigating past the mundane architectural blueprints and municipal tax filings. I found a subfolder labeled Bridge Capital. I clicked it open. The screen populated with dozens of scanned legal documents. I opened the primary file, my eyes scanning the dense bureaucratic text. It was a loan origination agreement from a prominent commercial lender out of Chicago. The borrowing entity was Prairie Horizon Holdings, the shadow company managed by Page. The loan amount was staggering. It far exceeded the liquid cash he had siphoned from my family trust. I scrolled down to the collateral section. My breath hitched, lodging painfully in my throat. I read the legal description of the asset securing the loan. It outlined the exact longitudinal and latitudinal coordinates of my family farm. It listed the acreage, the water rights, and the soil classifications. He had not just drained my checking accounts. He had leveraged the physical dirt. I flipped to the signature page. The document required the explicit authorization of the primary trust beneficiary. My name was signed on the dotted line. The ink matched my exact handwriting. A flawless forgery, executed by a man who had watched me sign thousands of compliance forms over the past 2 decades. He attached a power of attorney addendum granting himself the legal right to encumber the property on my behalf. The true, terrifying scope of his plan snapped into brutal focus. The stolen cash was merely the application fee. Page and her conglomerate required a severe capital injection to execute the regional land grab. Miles did not have that kind of money lying around, so he stole my identity. He used a forged power of attorney to pledge my generational prairie acreage as collateral for a commercial bridge loan. If the deal went through, the conglomerate would absorb the distressed properties, Miles would receive his buyout, and he would vanish. The Chicago bank would eventually call in the loan. When the shadow company defaulted, the bank would execute the lien. They would foreclose on my family farm. My husband had placed a ticking financial bomb directly beneath the soil my grandfather bled for. My vision narrowed, the edges of the room turning dark. The timeline had just accelerated. We were no longer just fighting a corporate acquisition. We were fighting a ticking clock. If I did not drop the legal guillotine before the closing date, I would lose the very ground I stood on. The trap Elias and Cameron were building had to be perfect, because a single mistake would mean my eradication. The glow of the computer monitor cast a pale blue hue across my cramped office, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the sterile air. I stared at the digital rendering of the forged power of attorney until my eyes burned. The sheer magnitude of my husband's deception threatened to suffocate me. He was not just stealing my liquid cash. He had pledged the very soil of my family homestead to a Chicago lending institution. The bridge loan was staggering, carrying a principal balance that would guarantee foreclosure the moment his corporate shadow entity defaulted. He engineered a scenario where he would collect his lucrative buyout and vanish, leaving me holding a worthless, imploding debt while the bank seized my ancestral land. I placed my hands flat against the cool surface of my desk. I needed to separate the emotional devastation from the analytical task at hand. Panic was a luxury I could not afford. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the scent of old paper and ozone, forcing my racing heart into a steady, methodical rhythm. I was an agricultural compliance officer. I spent 2 decades identifying discrepancies in municipal filings, zoning permits, and subsidy applications. I caught corporate fraudsters trying to claim drought relief for irrigated acres. I tracked missing decimal points that altered entire municipal budgets. I knew how to find the flaw in the armor. I leaned forward, gripping the computer mouse, and magnified the signature block on the digital document. The screen zoomed in to 400%. Miles was an exceptional craftsman of deceit. He had captured the exact slant of my cursive. He replicated the heavy pressure I applied on the downstroke of the capital letter A and the swift fading tail of the letter E. He likely scanned a legitimate compliance authorization I left on the kitchen counter, isolated my handwriting, and digitally overlaid it onto the commercial loan agreement. To an untrained bank underwriter sitting in a high-rise office 1,000 miles away, the authorization appeared flawless. It looked like a legally binding transfer of generational wealth. But Miles was a commercial real estate developer. He operated in a world of digital signatures, expedited email approvals, and frictionless electronic funds transfers. He possessed profound arrogance regarding his own intelligence, viewing my career as a quaint, bureaucratic hobby. He never bothered to truly understand the rigorous, archaic mechanics of South Dakota agricultural law. My eyes scanned the stark white space occupying the lower right corner of the document, directly adjacent to the forged signature. The empty space felt loud, like a missing instrument in a symphony. A slow, chilling realization crept up the back of my neck. 10 years ago, the Regional Agricultural Commission recognized a rising trend in electronic deed fraud. Commercial conglomerates were exploiting digital loopholes to strip vulnerable farmers of their water rights. In response, the state legislature mandated a physical anti-fraud measure for any high-level collateral transfer involving generational acreage or riparian zones within my specific district. I pushed my chair back from the desk. The wheels rolled across the hardwood floor with a harsh scrape. I knelt beside the heavy steel filing cabinet tucked into the corner of the room. Reaching into my blazer pocket, I retrieved a small silver key. I unlocked the bottom drawer, pulling it open. The metal glides hissed. Resting inside a velvet-lined wooden box was my official authorization implement. It was not a digital token or a software password. It was a heavy, vintage brass matrix engraved with the state seal and my unique compliance identification number. Beside it lay a stick of dark crimson sealing wax. It was a tangible, old-world requirement designed specifically to prevent the exact type of corporate theft my husband was currently attempting. I lifted the brass stamp, feeling its solid, grounding weight in my palm. The cold metal pressed against my skin. Every contract, every collateral pledge, and every zoning transfer I approved required this physical imprint. A digital signature was legally insufficient for encumbering protected agricultural land in my jurisdiction. Without the crimson wax and the embossed brass seal, any authorization was fundamentally incomplete. I stood up, walking back to the glowing monitor. I looked at the pristine, empty white space on the forged Chicago bank loan. Miles bypassed my office to avoid detection, routing his shadow entity through a neighboring county. He scanned my handwriting to bypass the underwriters. He thought he outsmarted the entire system, but he forgot the stamp. He ignored the physical anchor of my regulatory authority because he never respected my profession enough to learn its rules. His condescension was his undoing. Because this single detail was missing every contract he signed with Paige and her corporate conglomerate, every bridge loan he secured to fund the hostile land grab was legally voidable. The entire multi-million-dollar enterprise rested on a foundation of defective paperwork. I did not just possess a defense. I possessed a weapon. I held the exact mechanism needed to nullify his shadow empire with a single phone call. I reached for my phone, dialing the secure number Elias Thorne provided during our diner meeting. The line clicked open after a single ring. I found the structural failure I told the retired state regulator, my voice sharp and unwavering. I explained the digital forgery, the Chicago bridge loan, and the absent physical compliance seal. A low, appreciative hum resonated through the receiver. The arrogance of the corporate mind, Elias murmured. They always overlook the local friction. If the loan is voidable, the bank will recall the capital the moment we notify their fraud department. The shadow company will instantly lose its funding, and the acquisition contracts will default. We can freeze the entire operation. Yes, I agreed, staring at the brass matrix resting on my desk. But halting the loan is not enough. If we just stop the funding, Miles will claim ignorance. He will blame a clerical error, dissolve the LLC, and try again later. Paige will walk away clean, moving on to destroy the next rural district. We cannot just block the transaction. We must let them walk into the trap, lock the door, and detonate the structure while they are standing inside it. Elias remained silent for a long moment, processing the strategic shift. You want to execute the freeze at the exact moment of closing. I want them legally bound to the financial obligations they created, I clarified. If the funds fail to clear at the 0 hour, Paige and her conglomerate will turn on him. They will demand the capital he promised. But to ensure the state regulators can permanently dismantle her firm, we need undeniable proof that her corporate bosses knew Miles was the sole, unauthorized capital backer. We need to prove Paige was a willing participant in the fraud, not just a victim of his forgery. That requires a direct confession, Elias warned. A seasoned acquisitions director will never document that kind of liability in an email or a text message. She will keep the operational details strictly verbal. Then I will get her to say it out loud, I replied. I looked at the digital calendar synced to my monitor. A local agricultural zoning hearing was scheduled for the following week. It was a routine public forum meant to discuss upcoming commercial developments. Paige would be there. She had to attend to finalize the municipal approvals for the land she thought she was stealing. She would walk into my town, breathing my air brimming with unearned triumph. She would expect to encounter the naive, supportive wife of her wealthy local proxy. She would expect to navigate a room full of simple farmers. She had no idea she was stepping onto a battlefield I controlled. I will handle the corporate mercenary, I promised Elias. You and Cameron prepare the federal injunctions. Draft the freeze orders based on the defective power of attorney. Keep them silent and unfiled until I give the signal. We drop the guillotine on closing day. I ended the call, the screen fading to black. I picked up the heavy brass compliance seal and locked it safely back inside the steel drawer. The ticking clock in the hallway no longer sounded like a countdown to my destruction. It sounded like the steady, inevitable march toward their ruin. I turned off the computer monitor, plunging the home office into darkness. I was ready to meet the enemy. The community center gymnasium served as the makeshift venue for the municipal zoning board hearings. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pallor over the folding chairs and scuffed wooden floorboards. Local farmers sat in small clusters, their weathered faces reflecting seasons of harsh sun and unpredictable rain. They wore denim and heavy flannel, speaking in hushed tones about grain prices and water tables. I sat at the front table, organizing my compliance folders, projecting the calm authority my district expected. The heavy metal double doors at the back of the gymnasium swung open. The ambient chatter died instantly. Paige walked into the room. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and narrow trousers, her heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. She carried an aura of predatory confidence, looking at the assembled farmers not as people, but as obstacles waiting for liquidation. She took a seat in the second row, crossing her legs and opening a sleek leather portfolio. She radiated corporate entitlement, entirely out of place in a room smelling of damp wool and old coffee. She did not know I was watching her. She did not know I recognized her face from the Sioux Falls Hotel lobby. To her, I was merely the local bureaucratic hurdle, the wife of her wealthy proxy. The hearing commenced. The board reviewed routine agricultural variances. When the agenda reached the commercial rezoning requests for the eastern sector, Paige stood. She approached the microphone with practiced ease, delivering a polished, sanitized presentation about rural revitalization and economic synergy. She utilized corporate jargon designed to confuse the board, painting her predatory holding company as a benevolent investor. I listened, keeping my expression neutral. The board called for a scheduled 10-minute recess before rendering their preliminary vote. The farmers stood stretching their legs and moving toward the urn of decaffeinated coffee at the back of the gymnasium. I remained seated, organizing my paperwork. I heard the sharp click of heels approaching my table. "Mrs. Price," a crisp voice said. I looked up. Paige stood across from me, extending a manicured hand. Her smile did not reach her eyes. It was a tight, calculated expression meant to establish immediate dominance. "I am Paige," she continued, lowering her hand when I did not immediately take it. "I am a colleague of your husband. Miles speaks very highly of your influence in the community." I stood up slowly, ensuring I met her gaze at eye level. The word colleague hung in the air, dripping with unearned familiarity. I studied her face, noting the sharp contour of her cheekbones and the cold calculation in her eyes. Then my gaze dropped to her throat. Resting against her collarbone, catching the harsh fluorescent light, was a brilliant solitaire diamond pendant set in 18-karat white gold. The jewelry matched the $12,000 receipt I found hidden in my husband's briefcase perfectly. It was the trophy of their successful corporate heist, purchased with funds siphoned from my family trust. A lesser woman might have cracked. A lesser woman might have demanded answers, letting the sting of betrayal fracture her composure. I felt a momentary spike of adrenaline, a cold thrill racing through my veins. The enemy was standing in my territory, wearing the evidence of her crime around her neck. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you, Paige," I said, offering a warm, gracious smile. "Miles mentions your firm often. He is very dedicated to this new venture." Paige relaxed a fraction of an inch, interpreting my warmth as naive compliance. She expected jealousy. She expected the insecure, suspicious wife. When I offered only polite professional courtesy, her innate arrogance surged forward. "We are executing a very complex acquisition strategy," Paige replied, smoothing the lapel of her blazer. "It requires intense collaboration." I stepped out from behind the table, closing the physical distance between us. I reached out my fingers, hovering just an inch from the diamond pendant resting on her chest. "That is a breathtaking necklace," I said, keeping my voice soft and filled with genuine admiration. The setting is exquisite. Did you purchase it in Sioux Falls? There is a specific boutique downtown that does custom work just like that. Paige froze. The confident smile slipped from her face, replaced by a sudden, jarring uncertainty. Her hand twitched, rising instinctively to cover the diamond before she forced it back to her side. She expected me to be oblivious. Naming the exact city and hinting at the specific jeweler shattered her perceived superiority. She searched my eyes for any sign of accusation, but I gave her nothing. I offered only the bright, empty gaze of a supportive spouse admiring a beautiful piece of jewelry. It was a gift, Paige managed to say, her voice losing its crisp edge. From a mentor. How generous, I replied smoothly. You must be a very valuable asset to your team. I pivoted, walking toward the coffee station, knowing she would follow. Predators cannot stand a shift in the power dynamic. She needed to reassert her dominance to prove she was the smartest person in the room. I reached into my blazer pocket, my thumb pressing the physical record button on the digital audio device concealed inside the lining. I poured a cup of black coffee, keeping my back to her. Miles works so incredibly hard, I said, adopting the tone of a proud, slightly overwhelmed partner. He spends hours securing all the financing for these local projects. I worry about the stress he carries acting as the sole capital provider for such large acquisitions. It seems like a heavy burden for one man to shoulder. I turned around, handing her a fresh cup. Paige took the coffee, her pride warring with her caution. The desire to correct me, to assert her own corporate supremacy over my husband, proved too strong to resist. She could not let me believe Miles was the mastermind. Your husband is a vital local liaison, Paige corrected, taking a sip of the bitter liquid. But you should not worry about his financial exposure, Mrs. Price. Prairie Horizon Holdings is a robust entity. I tilted my head, feigning mild confusion. But Miles told me he was the primary backer. He said he was personally capitalizing the local shell companies to ensure the community deals went through smoothly. Is he not the sole source of the acquisition funds? Paige offered a condescending laugh, the sound brittle and sharp. Miles is providing the initial bridge capital, yes, she confirmed, leaning closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He is funneling the local equity into our holding accounts to secure the initial deeds, but my conglomerate dictates the overarching financial structure. He is funding the groundwork, but we control the board. You can rest easy knowing my firm is managing the heavy lifting. The digital recorder in my pocket captured every single syllable. She confessed. She explicitly stated that Miles was the sole provider of the local equity securing the deeds, and she confirmed her conglomerate was actively managing the shadow accounts receiving those funds. She admitted her willing participation in the illicit financial structure. Elias Thorne needed proof that the corporate bosses knew Miles was the illicit capital backer. Paige just handed me the verified audio evidence on a silver platter. That is a relief to hear, I said, offering a relieved sigh. I am glad he has such competent partners handling the details. The board chairman struck his wooden gavel against the front table, signaling the end of the recess. Paige offered a smug, victorious smile, believing she had successfully managed a clueless local wife while securing her zoning variances. She turned and walked back to her seat, her diamond necklace catching the light one last time. I returned to my table, my thumb sliding over the stop button on the hidden recorder. The trap possessed its final mechanism. The regulatory authorities now had the undeniable proof required to dismantle the corporate entity and prosecute the acquisitions director. Paige would leave this town feeling triumphant, entirely unaware she had just woven her own legal noose. The zoning board approved the preliminary variances, setting the stage for the final closing date. I packed my folders, the audio recorder burning a satisfying weight in my pocket. The boardroom bait was a flawless victory, but the war was far from over. As I walked out of the municipal building into the crisp prairie afternoon, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Cameron. The forensic accountant rarely called during business hours, unless the data shifted. I answered the call expecting a routine update on the injunction filings. Instead, the voice on the other end delivered a chilling revelation, uncovering a hidden corporate clause that threatened to turn my carefully constructed trap into a mutual suicide pact. The digital audio file uploaded flawlessly to the secure server Elias established for our investigation. Hearing Paige explicitly admit her role in the shadow accounts solidified the case against the corporate conglomerate. The regulatory mechanism was primed. But just as the satisfaction of capturing the confession settled over me, my phone buzzed with an urgent vibration. The caller identification displayed Cameron's secure line. I walked to the far end of the municipal parking lot, putting distance between myself and the departing farmers. The cold wind bit through my blazer, matching the sudden chill in my veins. I answered the call. Aubrey Cameron said, bypassing any professional greeting. The accountant sounded tense, a rare occurrence that immediately elevated my heart rate. I initiated the final review of the corporate acquisition contracts retrieved from the stolen hard drive. The closing date is scheduled for Friday morning at 10. We have exactly 48 hours to execute the federal injunctions. The timeline was tight, but expected. I sent the audio file to Elias. I informed Cameron, maintaining a steady tone. We possess the proof required to authorize the freeze orders. The forged power of attorney provides the legal justification to lock the escrow accounts. We are ready to drop the guillotine. There is a complication, Cameron interjected, the sharp edge of concern cutting through the digital connection. I spent the last 3 hours analyzing the indemnity clauses buried in the final pages of the contract structure. Paige drafted the localized agreements. My brow furrowed. I paced along the edge of the asphalt gravel, crunching beneath my heels. Paige managed the shell companies. She facilitated the land transfers. Of course she drafted the agreements. You are missing the nuance, Cameron pressed. She did not just draft standard corporate liability protections. She engineered a localized default trigger. The contract stipulates that if the initial bridge capital, the funds your husband secured using the forged collateral, fails to clear the escrow account by the designated closing hour, the corporate conglomerate is immediately absolved of all financial obligations. I stopped pacing. The implication was severe, but standard in high-stakes commercial real estate. If the money does not arrive, the deal dies. It is worse than a dead deal, Cameron continued, delivering the fatal twist. The clause shifts the entirety of the defaulted bridge loan, including exorbitant penalty fees and the immediate seizure of the collateral, directly onto the local proxy. It shifts the liability entirely onto Miles. The cold prairie wind seemed to stop. The silence in the parking lot was absolute. Explain that to me in plain English, I demanded, my grip tightening on the phone. Cameron sighed, the sound echoing through the receiver. Paige was never planning to share the profits with him. She structured the agreement to consume him. If the deal closes successfully, the conglomerate absorbs the land and Miles gets a fraction of the buyout he expects. But if the deal fails, the conglomerate walks away clean, and the Chicago bank executes the lien on your family farm to cover the defaulted loan. Paige built a trap door, and your husband is standing directly on it. The brilliance of the corporate mercenary strategy was terrifying. She identified a local developer driven by immense ego and blinding greed. She utilized his money, his connections, and his fraudulent collateral to secure the acquisitions. She insulated her firm completely. If everything went according to plan, she delivered a massive portfolio of water rights to her bosses. If the operation encountered friction, she sacrificed Miles, leaving him buried under millions of dollars of insurmountable debt. He thought he was the mastermind. He thought he was playing a high-level game of corporate chess, ready to trade his wife for a newer model. He did not realize Paige was playing him from the very beginning. The toxic alliance was built on a foundation of mutual betrayal. If we file the federal injunctions, I said slowly, the reality of the situation clicking into focus. If we freeze the escrow accounts based on the forged signature, the funds will bounce on Friday morning. Exactly, Cameron confirmed. Your injunction will not just halt the transaction. It will actively trigger the default clause Paige wrote into the contract. You will ignite the bomb she placed beneath him. The moral weight of the decision descended upon my shoulders. I spent the last several weeks preparing to stop my husband from destroying my life. Now I held the power to facilitate his total financial obliteration. I possessed the mechanism to let the two corporate predators tear each other apart. If I trigger the default, the bank still holds the lien on the farm. I pointed out, identifying the critical flaw in the scenario. If Miles goes bankrupt, they will foreclose on the collateral. I will lose the land anyway, not if the collateral was secured through documented fraud. Cameron countered the unyielding logic, returning to the accountant's voice. That is why the missing compliance stamp is paramount. Once the injunction freezes the funds, causing the default, the bank will attempt to seize the property. At that exact moment, we introduce the evidence of the forgery. The loan becomes instantly voidable. The bank cannot seize an asset pledged through identity theft. The debt remains entirely with Miles, unattached to the physical dirt. It was a masterstroke of legal architecture. We would use the enemy's own weapon against them. We would let Paige pull the trigger, destroying Miles. And then we would use the forged paperwork to shield my legacy from the blast radius. File the paperwork, I ordered, my voice ringing clear and hard across the empty lot. Draft the silent injunctions. Present the evidence of the forged power of attorney to the federal magistrate. Lock the escrow accounts tight. Do not let a single dollar move. I will initiate the filings immediately, Cameron replied. The orders will be sealed until the 0 hour. Once the bank attempts to clear the wire transfer on Friday morning, the system will reject the transaction. The freeze will be absolute. I ended the call, slipping the phone back into my pocket. The sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the prairie. The trap was set. The mechanisms were locked into place. The countdown had officially begun. I drove home, navigating the familiar county roads with a renewed sense of purpose. The tension that plagued me for the past 6 weeks evaporated, replaced by a cold, quiet anticipation. The facade of the oblivious wife was nearing its expiration date. Miles arrived home an hour after I did. He was practically vibrating with nervous energy, pacing the length of the living room while speaking rapidly into his mobile phone. He barked orders regarding closing documents and title insurance, his voice laced with the frantic adrenaline of a man nearing the finish line. He ended the call and walked into the kitchen, grabbing a bottle of water from the refrigerator. He looked exhausted, the skin around his eyes drawn tight, but his characteristic arrogance remained intact. "Friday is the day," he announced, leaning against the counter. "We finalize the signatures at 10 in the morning. By noon, the capital transfers and the deal is done." He offered a wide, triumphant smile. "We are going to be incredibly wealthy, Aubrey. The European vacation is just the beginning." I looked at him, truly seeing the man standing in my kitchen. He was a hollow shell, driven entirely by greed, blind to the fact that his corporate partner designed a contract meant to consume him, and entirely unaware that his wife possessed the detonator. "I am so proud of you," I said, matching his smile flawlessly. "I know how much you risked to make this happen." He chuckled, taking a long drink of water. It is all about managing the leverage, he boasted. He walked past me, heading upstairs to pack his briefcase for the final stretch. I remained at the kitchen island, watching his retreating back. The irony of his statement echoed in the quiet room. He believed he controlled the leverage. He did not know that the ground beneath his feet was already gone, and gravity was simply waiting for the clock to strike 10. Friday morning broke with a brilliant, blinding clarity. The South Dakota sky stretched overhead, an endless expanse of pale blue, devoid of a single cloud. Inside the house, the atmosphere buzzed with an electric, almost manic energy. Miles stood before the full-length mirror in the master bedroom, adjusting the collar of a custom-tailored navy suit. The fabric draped perfectly across his shoulders, radiating the expensive, polished aura of a man stepping into his ultimate triumph. He adjusted his silk tie, his fingers moving with practiced, fluid precision. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I watched him prepare for the culmination of his grand betrayal. He sprayed his signature cologne, the sharp scent of bergamot and cedar filling the space between us. Today is the day, he announced, turning to face me. His eyes gleamed with a predatory excitement. The final signatures happen at 10. By noon, the Capitol clears escrow. We are officially entering a new stratosphere, Aubrey. He walked over and pressed a firm, lingering kiss against my forehead. I closed my eyes, absorbing the profound irony of his affection. He was kissing the woman whose generational wealth he was actively stealing, thanking the victim for funding his escape. I will open a bottle of vintage champagne tonight, I told him, keeping my voice soft and encouraging. We can celebrate your big payday properly. He flashed a brilliant, blinding smile. Have your bags packed in your mind, he said, grabbing his leather briefcase from the chair. We are booking that Italian villa before the weekend is over. I followed him down the stairs and watched from the foyer as he climbed into his luxury sport utility vehicle. The engine roared to life, a deep, guttural sound that shattered the morning quiet. He offered one last confident wave through the windshield before backing out of the driveway. I stood in the open doorway, the crisp prairie wind biting through my thin sweater, and watched his taillights disappear down the county road. He was driving towards Sioux Falls. He was driving straight into a federal injunction. I retreated to the kitchen, pouring a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. The ceramic mug warmed my chilled fingers. I walked out onto the back porch, taking a seat in the weathered wooden rocking chair my grandfather built decades ago. The structure creaked softly under my weight. From this vantage point, I possessed an unobstructed view of the rolling eastern plains. The dormant winter wheat swayed gently in the breeze, a vast ocean of gold and brown extending all the way to the horizon. This land represented survival. It held the memories of calloused hands, unpredictable harvests, and stubborn resilience. Miles viewed it as disposable collateral. He underestimated the tenacity of the soil, and more importantly, he underestimated me. I set my mobile phone face up on the small patio table beside me. The digital clock on the screen read 9:45. In exactly 15 minutes, Miles would sit inside a sterile glass conference room in a downtown Sioux Falls banking institution. He would sit beside Paige, the ruthless acquisitions director, wearing her $12,000 diamond pendant. They would be surrounded by sharp-suited executives representing the out-of-state conglomerate. The closing documents would be signed, handshakes would be exchanged, the atmosphere would hum with mutual greed. Then Miles would authorize the final wire transfer. He would attempt to push millions of dollars of fraudulent bridge capital into the corporate escrow account. The clock shifted to 9:50. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The bitter liquid coated my tongue. I pictured Cameron sitting in that windowless accounting office, monitoring the secure financial portals, watching the trap wire pull tight. I pictured Elias Thorne waiting quietly in the wings, ready to dispatch the state regulatory notifications. 10 o'clock. The 0 hour arrived. I did not move. I simply watched the horizon, listening to the lonely cry of a red-tailed hawk circling high above the fields. 10:15. The screen of my mobile phone illuminated. A text message notification chimed, breaking the peaceful silence of the porch. The sender was Miles. The message was brief. Did you authorize any large transfers from the secondary accounts yesterday? Bank is showing a hold. I let the screen fade to black. I took another sip of my coffee. The bitter taste felt remarkably sweet. 10:22. Another chime. Aubrey, please call the local branch. My primary business cards are declining. They are saying the holding accounts are restricted. I need you to verify your identity with them immediately. The panic was beginning to seep through the digital text. He was sitting in a room full of corporate apex predators, trying to explain why his multi-million-dollar capital injection was suddenly paralyzed. The executives would be checking their watches. Paige would be narrowing her eyes, the first flicker of doubt piercing her arrogant facade. 10:35. The phone vibrated violently against the wooden table. An incoming call from my husband. I watched his name flash across the screen until the call rolled over to voicemail. I was not going to rescue him. I was not going to provide the reassuring voice he desperately sought. 10:40. A barrage of automated fraud alerts began flooding my inbox. The federal injunction executed perfectly. The magistrate froze every single asset tied to the forged power of attorney. The banking system recognized the illicit encumbrance and clamped down with brutal efficiency. The Chicago Lending Institution halted the bridge loan. The entire financial architecture of Prairie Horizon Holdings seized like an engine stripped of oil. 11:15. Another text message arrived. The grammar was erratic, the capitalization missing. Aubrey, pick up the phone. The wire bounced. The whole transfer bounced. They are talking about a federal lock. Did someone hack our accounts? Please tell me you are calling the fraud department. I leaned back in the rocking chair, resting my head against the slatted wood. He still believed it was a systemic error. He still believed he was the victim of a random cyber attack or a bureaucratic misunderstanding. His profound narcissism prevented him from considering the possibility that his wife engineered the collapse. He thought I was sitting in the kitchen frantically dialing customer service on his behalf. Noon approached. The midday sun climbed higher, casting short, sharp shadows across the porch. The situation in Sioux Falls was undoubtedly reaching critical mass. 12:10. The final message appeared on my screen. It was a chaotic string of desperate sentences. Paige is losing her mind. The executives are threatening litigation. The contract has a default trigger I did not know about. Aubrey, they are saying I am personally liable for the entire bridge penalty. Millions. I am ruined. Where are you? The alliance shattered. The moment the capital evaporated, the corporate mercenary turned on her local proxy. Paige engineered the contracts to consume him if the funds failed to clear, and the trapdoor had just swung wide open beneath his feet. She was screaming demands, scrambling to protect her own career, shifting the entirety of the financial liability squarely onto his shoulders. The executives were preparing to leave, dialing their own legal teams to initiate the slaughter. Miles was drowning. The exit strategy he spent months meticulously crafting dissolved into vapor within a matter of 2 hours. He was trapped inside a glass room with a woman who just betrayed him, facing an insurmountable debt that would eradicate his commercial real estate firm and destroy his professional reputation. Yet even in his absolute despair, he remained entirely blind to the true architect of his destruction. He begged me for help, unaware that I held the detonator and I had just pressed the button. I picked up my phone, dismissing his frantic messages with a simple swipe of my thumb. I opened a new text thread, addressing it to the secure number belonging to Elias Thorne. "The target has defaulted," I typed, hitting send. "Proceed to the next phase." I stood up from the rocking chair, picking up my empty coffee mug. The crisp prairie air filled my lungs clean and invigorating. The defensive posturing was officially over. The silent investigation concluded. Miles was broken, bleeding financially, and desperately searching for an explanation. It was time to pull him out of the dark and drag him into the blinding light of accountability. He needed a lifeline, and I was going to hand him a summons. I walked back inside the house, the quiet interior feeling remarkably spacious. The grand finale awaited, and the stage was set in a sterile, neutral jurisdiction where tears and manipulation held absolutely no currency. I knew exactly where my husband was at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Miles had fled the suffocating panic of the Sioux Falls banking institution, retreating to his local commercial real estate office to regroup. He was desperate, pleading credibility and searching frantically for a lifeline to salvage his crumbling empire. Instead of a lifeline, he found a thick, unmarked courier envelope resting on his mahogany desk. I orchestrated the delivery perfectly. The instructions inside were deliberately vague, but carried the undeniable weight of official authority. The letterhead bore the emblem of a prominent financial auditing firm, demanding the immediate presence of the primary stakeholders of Prairie Horizon Holdings. It cited a mandatory review of the federal hold placed on the Chicago Bridge Capital. It mandated his attendance at 3 o'clock sharp in Pierre, the state capital, warning that failure to appear would result in immediate referral to federal prosecutors. He had no choice. He was a rat trapped in a maze, and I had just opened the only available door. I drove west toward Pierre, leaving the rolling eastern plains behind. The landscape grew more rugged, the horizon expanding as I approached the seat of South Dakota's governmental power. This city was my domain. It was the epicenter of regulations, compliance laws, and bureaucratic oversight. It was the place where men like Miles came to beg for variances, and where women like me held the line. I navigated the quiet Capitol streets, parking beneath a sleek, modern commercial building. The architecture was unyielding, composed of sharp angles, brushed steel, and tinted windows. This was Cameron's territory. Choosing this specific venue was a calculated, tactical decision. If I confronted Miles in our living room, he would weaponize the space. He would use the plush leather sofas, the framed photographs on the mantel, the kitchen island we selected together to soften the blow. He would attempt to manipulate my emotions using 2 decades of shared history. I needed a location devoid of sentimentality. I needed a room where emotional leverage held zero currency. I stepped out of the elevator on the 4th floor. The air smelled of ozone-filtered oxygen and chilled glass. Cameron greeted me with a single curt nod, leading me down a silent corridor into the primary boardroom. The space was a masterpiece of intimidation. A long rectangular table, carved from a single slab of frosted glass, dominated the center. Ergonomic black mesh chairs lined the perimeter. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, indifferent view of the Missouri River. There was no warmth here. The environment was sterile, unforgiving, and designed exclusively for the brutal arithmetic of accountability. Elias Thorne arrived 10 minutes later. The retired state regulator hung his heavy wool coat on a polished steel rack. He wore a charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, transforming him from a quiet diner patron into the formidable government operative he used to be. He took a seat to my left, resting his hands flat on the glass surface. Cameron sat to my right, opening a silver laptop, the screen reflecting in the accountant's wire-rimmed glasses. I took the seat at the head of the table. I was no longer the supportive spouse. I was the executioner. We had 45 minutes until the scheduled meeting. I opened my leather tote bag and began extracting the physical evidence of his treason. Cameron had bound the documents in sleek black presentation folders, giving the timeline of destruction a clean professional aesthetic. I laid the folders out in chronological order, spacing them evenly across the frosted glass. The first folder contained the automated teller withdrawal logs and the receipt for the $12,000 diamond pendant. It established the initial deceit the petty thefts used to construct the illusion of a mundane romantic affair. The second folder held the state incorporation papers for Prairie Horizon Holdings. It highlighted Page's name as the registered managing director, proving the existence of the shadow entity operating just outside my municipal jurisdiction. The third folder contained the audio transcription and a digital storage drive holding the recording from the zoning board recess. It provided the undeniable verbal confession from the corporate mercenary confirming her firm actively managed the illicit local equity. The fourth folder featured the Chicago Bridge Loan Origination Agreement. It documented the staggering sum of capital required to fund the regional land grab. Finally, I placed the fifth folder directly in the center of the table. It lay open, displaying the forged power of attorney. I took a red felt pen and drew a meticulous, perfect circle around the empty white space adjacent to the replicated signature. The circle highlighted the fatal omission. It pointed directly to the missing vintage brass compliance seal. The visual timeline was complete. It told a story of profound arrogance, systematic theft, and ultimate failure. The digital clock on the wall shifted to 2:55. The silence inside the boardroom grew dense, heavy with anticipation. Cameron typed a rapid sequence of commands into the laptop, monitoring the locked escrow portals. Elias poured a glass of ice water from a crystal pitcher, the cubes clinking softly against the rim. I focused on my breathing, drawing the chilled, filtered air deep into my lungs. My pulse was remarkably steady. The paralyzing fear that gripped me weeks ago had entirely evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, predatory calm. At 2:58, the distant chime of the floor elevator echoed down the corridor. Footsteps approached. The sound was erratic, lacking the confident, measured stride my husband usually employed. I heard the sharp, frantic clicking of heels accompanying the heavy footfalls. They were walking fast, driven by the panic of a collapsing empire. Through the frosted glass walls of the corridor, I saw their blurred silhouettes approach the heavy double doors. I heard a hushed, vicious exchange. "You need to control the narrative in there," Paige hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed rage. "If this auditor cannot lift the federal hold, my bosses are going to shred you. Do not say a word until I assess the exposure. Just let me talk to the bank representative." Miles shot back, his tone ragged and defensive. "It is a compliance glitch. I can smooth it over." The brass handles turned. The heavy glass doors swung inward. Miles stepped into the room first, Paige following closely on his heels. The physical deterioration of my husband was shocking. The bespoke navy suit he donned with such pride that morning was now wrinkled and disheveled. His tie hung loose around his collar. A frantic sheen of sweat coated his forehead, and the skin around his eyes was dark with exhaustion. He looked like a man who spent the last 4 hours staring into the abyss of his own ruin. Paige gripped her leather portfolio like a shield. She wore the same charcoal blazer from the zoning hearing, the diamond pendant resting against her collarbone, but her predatory swagger was gone. She was trapped in the blast radius of a failing deal, desperate to locate a target to blame. They expected to find a low-level municipal bank auditor sitting at the table, someone they could charm, threaten, or bribe into lifting the financial restriction. Instead, they found me. Miles stopped dead in his tracks. His expensive leather shoes squeaked sharply against the polished floor. The breath rushed out of his lungs in a harsh, jagged gasp. His eyes locked onto mine. He blinked rapidly as if struggling to process a mirage. He looked at Cameron, absorbing the cold, calculating glare of the forensic accountant. He looked at Elias Thorne, a man whose reputation struck fear into the heart of every corrupt developer in the state. Then his gaze drifted downward, falling upon the meticulous arrangement of black folders spread across the frosted glass table. He saw the jewelry receipt. He saw the LLC registration. He saw the forged collateral agreement with the glaring red circle highlighting his fatal mistake. The color drained from his face with terrifying speed, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The glitch was not a systemic error. The federal hold was not a random bureaucratic oversight. Paige nearly collided with his back, sidestepping around him with an irritated huff. She opened her mouth to launch into her rehearsed corporate intimidation speech, but the words died in her throat. Her eyes landed on me. The arrogant sneer dissolved, replaced by a profound, paralyzing confusion. She recognized the naive, supportive wife from the coffee station. She saw the recording device sitting beside the printed transcription of her own voice. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted. The invisible walls of the trap sprang upward, sealing them inside a jurisdiction where they held zero leverage. I leaned forward, resting my forearms against the cool edge of the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a tearful accusation. "Please take a seat," I instructed, gesturing to the empty chairs opposite me. "We have a significant amount of paperwork to review before the banks finalize your default." Miles pulled out a black mesh chair, his movements stiff and stripped of their usual fluid grace. He sank into the seat across from me, his shoulders hunched. Paige remained standing for a long, agonizing moment, her posture rigid, before taking the chair at the far end of the table. She deliberately maximized the physical distance between herself and her local proxy, sensing the impending collapse. Aubrey Miles began forcing his lips into a strained, ghastly imitation of his charismatic smile. "I do not know why you felt the need to bring outside counsel into a simple, marital misunderstanding. The bank flagged a routine commercial transfer. It is a minor administrative hold. We can clear this up right now if you just verify your identity with the underwriter. I can dial the branch manager on speakerphone." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the frosted glass. He was drowning, yet he still reached for the familiar tools of manipulation. He hoped he could gaslight his way out of a federal freeze, treating me like the compliant, naive wife he left at the breakfast table. "There is no administrative hold," I stated. My voice echoed off the sterile walls, sharp and unyielding. "There is a federal injunction. The magistrate authorized the freeze at 10 o'clock this morning, effectively paralyzing every single account tied to Prairie Horizon Holdings." Miles blinked. His jaw slackened. The charm evaporated instantly, leaving a hollow, terrified shell. Paige leaned forward, her eyes darting between Cameron, Elias, and me. "What injunction?" she demanded, her voice brittle and laced with rising panic. "On what grounds?" I ignored the acquisitions director, keeping my gaze locked entirely on my husband. I reached for the fifth folder resting in the center of the table. I rotated the black cardboard, sliding the open document across the smooth glass until it stopped directly beneath his chin. "Look at the signature, Miles," I instructed. He stared down at the forged power of attorney. His breathing turned shallow and rapid, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "You captured the slant of my cursive beautifully," I continued. I kept my tone conversational, devoid of any heated anger. "You replicated the pressure on the downstroke of the vowels. It fooled the underwriting department in Chicago. It fooled your corporate partner sitting next to you. But you forgot the most critical component of agricultural compliance in this district. I tapped my index finger against the red circle drawn around the empty white space. Any encumbrance of generational prairie land requires my physical vintage brass compliance seal. Without the wax imprint, this authorization is legally voidable. The moment the bank attempted to clear your fraudulent bridge capital, Cameron presented the missing compliance requirement to the federal magistrate. The loan died in transit. The funds never moved. The silence that followed was total. The ambient hum of the building ventilation system seemed to roar in my ears. Miles stared at the empty white circle. The color of his face shifted from gray to a sickly pale white. He understood the magnitude of his error. He bypassed my office to evade detection, but his profound arrogance blinded him to the basic mechanics of my profession. He built a financial empire on a sheet of defective paper. Paige was the first to react. The corporate mercenary possessed a sharp survivor instinct. She processed the information, calculated her exposure, and immediately pivoted to protect her own career. He acted alone, Paige declared, standing up so fast her chair scraped harshly against the floorboards. She pointed an accusatory finger at Miles, her face twisting with self-preservation. My firm had no knowledge of this forgery. We operated under the assumption that the local equity was secured through legitimate channels. He presented himself as an authorized proxy. This is individual fraud. My holding company is insulating itself from his criminal liability. She was throwing him into the fire, attempting to utilize the trapdoor she built into the contracts. She wanted him to burn so she could walk away clean. You wrote the default clause, I said, shifting my cold gaze to her. You engineered the localized agreement to shift the bridge penalty onto him if the funds bounced. You planned to consume him the moment the deal encountered friction. Paige lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with cold defiance. It is standard corporate indemnification. He failed to deliver the capital. His fraudulent actions breached our contract. My firm is walking away, and we are holding him responsible for the damages. You are not walking anywhere. Elias Thorne spoke for the first time. The retired state regulator leaned forward, intertwining his fingers on the table. The authority in his voice commanded the room, a heavy, inescapable presence. I opened the third folder and slid the audio transcription toward Paige. I placed the small digital recording device right beside the printed pages. 2 days ago, during the municipal zoning recess, you and I shared a cup of coffee, I reminded her. You were quite eager to claim credit for the financial architecture of the land grab. You explicitly stated that your firm managed the shadow accounts while Miles provided the illicit equity. Paige looked down at the transcription. Her eyes scanned the printed words, reading her own arrogant confession. Her breathing stopped. Her chest froze in panic. State regulators are currently executing search warrants at your corporate headquarters, Elias informed her, his tone devoid of any sympathy. They possess the audio files. They know your executives authorized the acquisition of vulnerable farms using funds you knew were sourced through a localized proxy. You are not a victim of his forgery. You are a documented co-conspirator in a hostile, predatory consolidation. The invincible corporate acquisitions director crumbled. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. The tailored charcoal blazer suddenly looked 2 sizes too big, hanging loosely on her frame. The $12,000 diamond pendant caught the fluorescent light, a glittering reminder of the heist that just collapsed around her neck. She looked at the heavy door, then at the thick glass walls, realizing there was no exit. The legal trap held her tight. She grabbed her leather portfolio, her hands shaking so much the metal clasp rattled. She did not look at Miles. She did not offer a rebuttal. She simply turned and fled, pushing through the heavy double doors. Her heels clicked frantically down the corridor, until the sound faded into nothing. Miles remained seated. He did not watch her leave. He stared blankly at the frosted glass table, his mind short-circuiting as the reality of his obliteration set in. The corporate backing was gone. The Chicago bridge loan was dead. The millions of dollars in penalty fees from the defaulted commercial contract now rested squarely on his shoulders, thanks to the very trapdoor his former partner designed. "Aubrey," he whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, broken rasp. He lifted his head. His eyes welled with tears born of pure, unadulterated terror. "Please. They will take everything. My firm, my licenses. I will go to prison." "You made a series of choices," I replied, feeling no pity for the man sitting across from me. "You chose to drain my family trust. You chose to pledge the soil my grandfather bled for. You chose to stand in front of our friends and colleagues and joke about discarding me." I opened my leather tote bag one final time. I withdrew a thick stack of legal documents bound with a dark blue cover. I slid them across the table until they rested directly over the forged power of attorney. "These are the divorce filings," I explained, tapping the top page with my index finger. "Appended to the dissolution is a comprehensive liability waiver. It formally transfers the entirety of the defaulted bridge loan, the corporate penalties, and the financial restitution for the stolen trust funds directly into your name. You assume all the debt you created." He stared at the blue cover, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the crisp paper. "Sign it," Cameron instructed, speaking with the cold, unyielding precision of a surgeon. "Or we turn the unredacted hard drive over to the federal prosecutor before 5 o'clock today." Miles picked up the black pen resting beside the folder. His hand shook so badly he could barely grip the plastic barrel. He looked at me, searching my face for any trace of the woman who used to cook his favorite meals, the woman who offered him grace and quiet support for 20 years. He found nothing but a void. The ambient temperature of my soul matched the chilled glass of the boardroom. I offered no rescue, no reprieve, and no forgiveness. He lowered his head and signed his name on the dotted line. The ink flowed, dark and permanent. He initialed the liability transfer, condemning himself to a lifetime of insurmountable debt and professional ruin. I gathered the signed documents, slipping them carefully back into my tote bag. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer. Elias and Cameron stood with me, forming a united front of unyielding accountability. Miles sat slumped in the mesh chair, a broken, empty vessel. He looked up at me, his eyes red and hollow. "You wanted a newer model," I said, my voice ringing clear and final through the sterile room. "Consider this the final transaction." I turned and walked out of the boardroom, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind me. I did not look back. He was left sitting alone in the cold, unforgiving light, destroyed by the very paperwork he thought he could manipulate. The weeks following the boardroom ambush unfolded with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a controlled demolition. There were no dramatic screaming matches. There were no emotional pleas. The sheer volume of the documented evidence extinguished any possibility of a legal battle. Miles surrendered, immediately crushed under the weight of the liability waiver he signed. His commercial real estate firm dissolved within a month. He vacated our home in the dead of night, packing his expensive suits into the trunk of a rented sedan, looking years older than the man who stood at our anniversary party and joked about trading me in for a newer model. The legal aftermath played out exactly as Elias Thorne and Cameron predicted. The State Regulatory Commission moved swiftly, guided by the audio confession and the irrefutable paper trail. They descended upon the out-of-state corporate conglomerate, stripping Page of her credentials and launching a sweeping investigation into the firm's predatory acquisition practices. The shell companies, including Prairie Horizon Holdings, were permanently dismantled. The fraudulent contracts were voided, and the stolen water rights were returned to the local South Dakota farmers, safeguarding the community from the devastating impact of corporate consolidation. The Chicago Bank attempted to execute the lien on my family farm just as we anticipated. They cited the defaulted bridge loan, preparing to seize the property. It was the final test of the legal trap. Cameron submitted the certified documentation proving the power of attorney was forged, explicitly citing the missing vintage brass compliance seal. The federal magistrate reviewed the evidence and immediately ruled in our favor. The loan was declared voidable due to documented identity theft. My generational acreage remained untouchable, securely anchored to my name, while the millions of dollars in defaulted penalties remained squarely on Miles's shoulders. He was personally bankrupted by the very mechanism his partner designed to consume him. The crisp air of a South Dakota autumn settled over the prairies. 1 year had passed since the anniversary dinner. I stood on the back porch of my home, wrapped in a thick wool sweater, a steaming mug of black coffee resting in my hands. The morning sun crested the horizon, casting a brilliant golden light across the dormant fields of winter wheat. The landscape stretched out before me, vast and unbroken, a silent testament to endurance. The house felt different now. The ambient tension that hummed beneath the floorboards for the last 5 years of my marriage was completely gone. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was spacious, clean, and restorative. I had reclaimed my space, my legacy, and my peace of mind. True healing, I realized, does not arrive in a single explosive moment of triumph. It does not look like a cinematic victory lap. It arrives quietly, in the small, unremarkable moments of daily life. It is the realization that you can drink your morning coffee without analyzing the micro-expressions of the person sitting across from you. It is the profound relief of knowing that nobody in your home is lying to you. My professional life flourished. The community quietly learned of the role I played in dismantling the predatory conglomerate. I never sought public recognition, but the farmers understood who safeguarded their livelihoods. They looked at me with a renewed, deep-seated respect. I was no longer just a compliance officer. I was a silent guardian of the soil. Later that afternoon, I drove into town. The streets were quiet, the air smelling of fallen leaves and wood smoke. I parked my car near the local diner, the same establishment where I first formed the alliance that saved my life. I walked inside, the bell above the door chiming a familiar greeting. Elias Thorne sat in a corner booth nursing a cup of coffee. He wore a faded flannel shirt, looking entirely at ease in his retirement. I slid into the vinyl seat across from him. We did not need to rehash the details of the operation. The war was won, and the casualties were exactly where they belonged. We shared a quiet smile, an acknowledgement of mutual respect between two professionals who understood the precise mechanics of accountability. I often think about the woman I was a year ago, sitting in that upscale lodge, listening to my husband humiliate me in front of our peers. I remember the cold condensation on my champagne glass and the suffocating pressure to maintain a flawless, icy smile. I remember the paralyzing fear of discovering the depth of his betrayal, the realization that the man I trusted was orchestrating my total financial obliteration. But I also remember the moments I stopped acting like a victim and started acting like an auditor. I remember the cold, calculated clarity that replaced my grief. I remember the profound satisfaction of sliding those forged documents across the frosted glass table, watching the architecture of his deceit crumble under the weight of undeniable facts. If you are listening to this, and you find yourself trapped in a situation where someone is actively underestimating you, I want you to remember this story. I want you to understand that silence is not an admission of defeat. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is simply the time you require to observe the patterns, gather the evidence, and build the perfect trap. You do not have to scream to be heard. You do not have to match their chaos with your own. You can retreat into the shadows, align yourself with unfeeling logic, and meticulously construct a paper trail that no amount of charm or manipulation can erase. You can let them believe they are winning right up until the moment you drop the guillotine. I want to hear your thoughts. If you were sitting at that anniversary dinner, would you have maintained your composure, or would you have confronted him immediately? Have you ever had to rely on cold logic to navigate a betrayal that threatened to break you? Please share your experiences in the comments below. I read every single one, and I find profound strength in the stories of resilience you share. Thank you for spending this time with me and for allowing me to share the reality of how I reclaimed my life. There are many more stories of quiet strength and calculated retribution waiting to be told. Please subscribe to Emily Told Stories so you never miss a narrative. Until next time, remember to protect your peace, safeguard your legacy, and never underestimate the devastating power of a well-documented truth. The soil of South Dakota holds memories better than any photograph. When the winter frost thaws and the Missouri River swells against its banks, the earth exhales the scent of generations past, of calloused hands, failed harvests, and quiet survival. I stood on my back porch exactly 1 year after I slid a stack of forged loan documents across a frosted glass table, effectively ending a 2-decade marriage. The dust has settled. The corporate shell companies are dissolved. The land remains securely in my name. Yet the lingering echo of my husband's betrayal forces me to look beyond my own survival. It forces me to look at the sprawling farmhouses dotting the eastern prairies and wonder what exactly we are teaching the children growing up inside them. We speak often of traditional American family values. We frame this concept around Sunday dinner's unyielding loyalty and the sacred permanence of the marital bond. We instruct our children to honor their commitments. But what happens when those noble values are weaponized? Miles utilized my dedication to our vows as a smokescreen for his corporate heist. He banked on the assumption that a good traditional wife would prioritize the illusion of domestic peace over the cold, hard arithmetic of reality. In our culture, we tend to raise children with a flawed understanding of emotional awareness. We raise boys in a society that often rewards the charismatic closer, the man who views every interaction as a transaction and learns early on that charm can excuse a multitude of sins. We applaud their ambition, their competitive edge, and their ability to conquer the room, rarely pausing to ask if their success is built on a foundation of genuine fairness. Miles was the product of this exact environment. He was taught to acquire, to leverage, and to liquidate. He was never taught the profound, quiet strength of honest stewardship. Conversely, we raise our daughters to endure. We teach young girls to be the peacemakers, the emotional shock absorbers of the family unit. We condition them to smile politely when someone makes a cruel joke at an anniversary party, just as I did. We tell them that their primary virtue lies in their capacity for endless forgiveness and their ability to hold a family together, even when the foundation is rotting from within. We teach them that compromise is synonymous with love, but keeping the peace in a house built on lies is not a virtue. It is slow-motion surrender. If we truly want to instill lasting family responsibility, we must redefine what traditional values actually mean. True familial duty is not about hiding ugly truths behind a pristine white picket fence. It is about facing the darkest elements of human nature with unwavering clarity. When I held my grandfather's vintage brass compliance stamp, the very tool that nullified my husband's fraudulent bridge loan, I realized it was a metaphor for how we must guide the next generation. There must be a physical, undeniable standard of truth in how we raise our youth. You cannot forge character, and you cannot digitally replicate emotional integrity. We must teach our sons that authentic power is never derived from exploiting the vulnerable or treating a partner as a disposable asset. A man's legacy is not measured by his portfolio, but by the safety and stability he provides to the people who trust him. We must demand an emotional vocabulary from them that extends beyond ambition and conquest, and we must fundamentally change the way we guide our daughters. We have to stop raising them to be excellent victims. Instead of teaching young women how to weather a storm with quiet grace, we must teach them how to become the architects of stronger fortresses. We must teach them to audit their relationships with the same rigorous, unsentimental logic used to review a municipal zoning permit. Here's the truth that goes against everything polite society whispers in church pews and parent-teacher associations. Unconditional loyalty is a dangerous, toxic myth. Conventional wisdom insists that family is everything, that love conquers all, and that unwavering devotion is the highest moral path. It is not. The highest moral path is clarity. Unconditional trust is a privilege that must be continuously earned, not a blank check handed out simply because a vow was spoken or a ring was exchanged. When we teach children to forgive blindly, we strip them of their protective instincts. Sometimes, the most profound act of love a parent can offer a child is the permission to walk away. We must teach them that it is acceptable, even necessary, to build a trap for the wolves that wear familiar faces. Family responsibility means showing our children the raw, unvarnished reality of consequences. If I had forgiven my husband, if I had quietly covered up his theft to save the family and preserve the illusion of our 2-decade marriage, what lesson would I be carving into the history of this land? I would be teaching the next generation that betrayal is permissible as long as it is wrapped in an expensive bespoke suit. I would be demonstrating that a woman's worth is secondary to a man's pride. Instead, I taught a different lesson. I proved that boundaries, when enforced with cold logic and unyielding facts, are stronger than any emotional manipulation. As the sun dips below the Missouri River, casting long, dark shadows across the dormant winter wheat, I feel a profound sense of peace. The prairie wind carries no secrets tonight. The dirt beneath my boots belongs to me, secured not by blind faith, but by undeniable truth. If this narrative resonated with you, if you have ever found yourself questioning the conventional advice that tells you to stay quiet and keep the peace at your own expense, I invite you to join our community. Please subscribe to Emily Told Stories. We share narratives that challenge the expected, offering a space for those who refuse to shrink themselves to fit into someone else's broken design. As you go about your day, look closely at the structures you are building in your own life. Are you holding on to a relationship, a job, or a family tradition merely because society told you it was the right thing to do? Or are you cultivating a life built on undeniable, verifiable truth? The people we share our lives with are either planting seeds for our future or quietly digging our graves. The soil rarely tells you which one it is until the harvest arrives. What exactly is growing in yours?